Picture a squirrel losing its grip near the top of an old oak, 60 feet up, roughly level with the roof of a six-story building. For a person, that fall is fatal, no argument needed. For the squirrel, it becomes almost routine. It tumbles through open-air limbs, spread wide, and within seconds hits the ground, pauses for half a beat, then sprints off as if nothing happened. This is not a rare stunt caught on a lucky camera. Wildlife biologists and rehabilitators report it often enough that it barely counts as news among people who study these animals closely. The squirrel's body is built to survive exactly this kind of accident, and the accident itself is common, since a life spent leaping branch to branch guarantees the occasional missed grip. What looks like luck up close is closer to a built-in safety margin, tested constantly and rarely failing. You could watch 100 squirrels navigate the same tree limbs and never see one fall, and then witness it happen once purely by chance and still see the animal walk away. That gap between what should happen and what actually happens is where curiosity about this animal begins. Nothing about the fall is exaggerated for effect, and nothing about the landing needs to be. The real explanation lies in how the squirrel's body meets the air on the way down, and that mechanism turns out to be one of the more elegant tricks in the entire animal kingdom. The trick is simple physics, not natural magic. When a squirrel falls, it spreads its forelimbs wide and flattens its body, turning itself into something closer to a small furry kite than a falling stone. That flared tail joins the limbs to catch more air, and together they increase the surface, pushing against the atmosphere on the way down. A heavier, denser object slices through air with little resistance, but a light body with a large surface area meets far more drag, and drag slows a fall. Think of how a flat sheet of paper drifts gently to the floor, while that same sheet, crumpled into a tight ball, drops fast and hard. A squirrel weighing little more than a can of soup spread wide against the air behaves far more like the open sheet than the crumpled one. Its low body weight paired with that increased surface area caps its top falling speed at a level its skeleton and joints can absorb on impact. A human body, dense and comparatively narrow for its weight, reaches a far higher terminal velocity and cannot dissipate that same impact safely. None of this makes the squirrel invincible, and hard landings on pavement or from far greater heights can still injure or kill it. But within the range, it typically falls from tree canopy to forest floor. Its proportions do the survival work long before instinct or reflex gets involved. The body itself is the safety equipment. Watch one squirrel through a single October afternoon and you might count a few dozen trips each one, ending with a quick dig, a drop, a pat of soil, and a dash to the next spot. Multiply that afternoon by every daylight hour of the season, and the running total climbs into territory that sounds invented until you check the field research behind it. Wildlife biologists tracking tagged animals have documented individual squirrels burying well over 10,000 nuts across a single autumn, each one placed in its own separate hole rather than gathered into one central pile. That is not an estimate padded for drama. It reflects actual observed caching rates during peak acorn and hickory seasons, when trees drop far more food than any one animal could eat before it spoils. Picture 10,000 separate errands, each with its own precise location, its own timing, its own decision about worth. No spreadsheet, no notebook, no marked map, just a small mammal working almost non-stop through the cooling weeks of fall. The number alone is startling, but it is only the setup for a harder question. Burying that much food is one kind of feat. Finding a meaningful share of it again weeks or months later under snow after storms after the landscape itself has changed is another feat entirely, and it is the one that turns this animal from a hard-working hoarder into something far stranger to understand. No scent trail leads a squirrel back to buried food the way some people assume. Snow, rain, and shifting soil erase most surface clues within days, and squirrels searching purely by smell would fail constantly, especially through a hard winter. Instead, the animal depends overwhelmingly on spatial memory, an internal map built from landmarks, distances, and its own remembered path of movement across the territory. Imagine trying to recall the exact parking space you used at a shopping center visited only once months ago. Then imagine doing that correctly thousands of times over, spot after spot spread across an area the size of several city blocks. That is roughly the scale of the task facing a squirrel each winter. Researchers studying cache recovery have found that squirrels do retrieve a substantial share of their own buried food, performing far better than random searching would predict, which strongly suggests genuine memory at work rather than luck or smell alone. The animal is not simply better at finding food in general. It appears to be recalling specific locations it chose and marked mentally months earlier. That capacity sits at the center of what makes squirrel behavior worth taking seriously as more than instinct. A brain smaller than a golf ball is doing spatial bookkeeping that would challenge most people, handed the same task on paper, and it is doing it quietly every single winter, without anyone applauding. Here is where the story stops looking like simple hoarding. Researchers observing squirrels in both field and laboratory settings have documented a specific behavior, now well established in the scientific literature. A squirrel that senses it is being watched by another animal will dig a hole, go through the full motion of burying something, pat down the dirt convincingly, and walk away, all without actually placing any food inside. The rival, watching from a distance, sees exactly what it expects to see, a completed cache, and may later waste time and energy digging up nothing at all. The real food, meanwhile, sits safely elsewhere, buried earlier or buried later, away from prying eyes. This was not assumed or guessed at. Scientists tracked the behavior directly, comparing how often squirrels performed decoy burials when alone versus when another animal was nearby, and paying attention, and the pattern held up. Deception, this specific aimed at shaping what another creature believes to be true, is not something researchers expected to find in a rodent best known for raiding bird feeders. It reshaped how seriously scientists take squirrel cognition. A behavior this deliberate does not happen by accident, and it does not happen without some internal sense, however basic, of what another set of eyes can and cannot detect. That distinction matters more than it first appears, and it is worth sitting with for a moment before moving on. Strip away the drama and what remains is a matter of stakes. 10,000 buried nuts represent an entire winter's food security, and losing a meaningful share of that stockpile to theft is not a minor inconvenience. It is potentially the difference between a squirrel surviving the hard months ahead or not. Theft from rivals is common in the squirrel world, since every animal in a given area is caching in roughly the same patch of ground, competing for the same limited trees. A decoy burial costs the deceiving squirrel almost nothing, a few seconds of digging and covering while potentially saving an entire real cache from discovery. Viewed this way, the trick stops looking like a clever party stunt and starts looking like a calculated insurance policy paid for in dirt and effort rather than money. The behavior only appears when it is needed, meaning squirrels caching in private unwatched do not bother with the extra motions, which is itself telling. It suggests the deception is not a fixed, automatic reflex, but something closer to a response triggered by the specific presence of a threat to the food supply. Whatever is happening inside that small skull, it is responsive rather than robotic. This early glimpse of hidden intelligence is only the beginning. Later in this story, that same capacity for adjusting behavior based on what another creature might know or intend will surface again in a far more developed form. Ask most people to name an impressive wild animal, and squirrels rarely make the list, mostly because familiarity breeds a particular kind of blindness. They are everywhere, which paradoxically makes them invisible. City parks, university quads, suburban yards, even downtown planters wedged between office buildings, all host thriving squirrel populations, often at higher densities than the same species reaches in undisturbed forest. If you have ever poured effort into a bird feeder complete with a squirrel baffle purchased specifically to solve the problem, only to look out the window a week later and find the feeder empty and the baffle apparently decorative, you already know something about how well this animal has adapted to human neighborhoods. The garden fence meant to keep something out rarely does much against a creature that can leap, climb, and squeeze through gaps most people would not think possible. None of this is an accident of poor planning on the squirrel's part. Cities offer abundant food, fewer natural predators, and countless nesting sites in old buildings, attics, and ornamental trees, and squirrels have exploited every bit of that opportunity with total efficiency. The animal treats a modern American town the way its ancestors treated an old-growth forest, as a landscape of resources to be mapped, cached, and defended. That kind of adaptability deserves more credit than a mildly annoyed shrug from anyone who has lost a tomato plant to one. Central Park's gray squirrels were not always native residents, simply extending their range into a growing city. Historical records show that beginning in the 1850s, small numbers of squirrels were deliberately released into the park and other urban green spaces, as a novelty meant to add a touch of woodland charm to a newly designed public landscape. The idea caught on. Similar releases followed in cities across the country over the following decades, as parks departments and private citizens alike decided that a park without squirrels felt incomplete. Those founding populations found conditions nearly ideal since city parks offered mature trees, deliberately planted food sources, and none of the predators that would have thinned their numbers back in an unmanaged forest. Within a few generations, descendants of those original released animals had become a fixture of the urban landscape so thoroughly established that most visitors today assume the squirrels simply belong there as natural to the park as the trees themselves. In a sense, they do belong now. But the origin story is more deliberate than most people realize. A quiet piece of 1800s urban planning still visible every single day to anyone crossing the park. It is a reminder that some of the most familiar wildlife in American cities arrived by very human decisions, not by accident, and that those decisions can echo for well over a century afterward. A single squirrel's home range typically covers somewhere between 1 and a few acres, depending on food availability and how crowded the local population happens to be. Within that modest patch of ground, smaller than most public parks, an individual animal may scatter thousands of separate caches over the course of one season, each one a distinct location rather than a repeated spot used again and again. Picture that acre or two divided into an invisible grid, far finer than anything drawn on paper, every square holding the possibility of a buried acorn known to exactly one animal on Earth. Neighboring squirrels overlap in the same general territory, digging and burying in much the same soil. Yet each one is working from its own private mental map, layered invisibly over the others. From above, the ground looks uniform: patchy grass, scattered leaves, ordinary dirt. Underneath it holds an intricate overlapping filing system with no shared index and no way for one squirrel to read another's records. That density of hidden information packed into such a small area is difficult to picture until you try to imagine walking across your own backyard knowing that beneath your feet sit dozens or even hundreds of buried decisions, each one made deliberately, each one meant to be found again by a creature with no notebook and no map beyond the one carried entirely inside its head. Not every buried nut gets recovered, and that fact alone raises a genuine scientific debate rather than a settled statistic. Estimates for how many caches a squirrel successfully relocates vary noticeably across different studies, shaped by differences in habitat, weather severity, and how researchers design their tracking methods in the first place. Some studies using tagged nuts suggest recovery rates are respectably high, well above what chance alone would produce. Other research, especially through unusually harsh winters or in areas with heavy snowpack, shows recovery dropping off considerably, with a meaningful share of caches going permanently unclaimed, rather than treating any single number as the final word. Researchers studying this behavior generally agree on the pattern rather than the precise figure, which is that squirrel memory performs well above random guessing, but still falls well short of perfect recall. That gap between forgetting everything and remembering everything is exactly where the science remains most active and most interesting. It also happens to be the gap that keeps forests regenerating, since every abandoned cache is a potential seedling, a detail this story will return to later. For now, the honest answer to how good squirrel memory really is remains somewhere in the middle, genuinely impressive, not infallible, and still being measured carefully by people who spend entire— Before a nut ever reaches the ground, a squirrel puts it through a quick inspection that looks almost comical up close, a rapid shake near the ear, followed by a brief weighing motion in the front paws. That small ritual is not idle fidgeting. Researchers studying feeding behavior have found that squirrels can detect subtle differences in weight and sound that reveal whether a nut is solid and healthy or hollowed out by insects and rot. A good nut carries real heft and produces almost no sound when shaken. A compromised one, lighter and often rattling faintly from insect damage inside the shell, gets identified within seconds. This matters because burying a bad nut wastes effort twice over, once digging the hole and again months later retrieving a moldy, worthless reward. A squirrel effectively runs quality control on its own food supply before committing any energy to storage, filtering out the losses early rather than discovering them the hard way in the middle of January. It is the kind of quiet competence easy to miss, unless you happen to be standing still enough, patient enough to watch one animal work through an entire pile of fallen acorns nut by nut. Each one gets its brief audition, and only the ones that pass earn a spot in the ground, buried with the confident economy of an animal that has performed this exact test thousands of times before. Once a squirrel identifies a nut as compromised, the response is immediate and practical rather than wasteful. Instead of discarding it or burying it anyway, the animal simply eats it on the spot, extracting whatever nutritional value remains before the nut spoils further or draws insects. This on-the-spot consumption solves two problems at once. It prevents the squirrel from wasting a burial effort on food unlikely to survive until it is needed. and it lets the animal claim immediate calories rather than none at all. Healthy nuts, by contrast, get the opposite treatment, entirely carried off and buried individually across the surrounding territory. Saved deliberately for a future moment of scarcity, rather than eaten right away, even though hunger might make that tempting. This split decision, eat now or save for later, happens constantly throughout a single afternoon of foraging nut after nut, each one triaged in a matter of seconds. It reflects a kind of built-in budgeting most people recognize instinctively from their own lives. The difference between spending a little today and setting something aside for a leaner month ahead. A squirrel making that call correctly over and over, season after season, is running a functioning economy of scarcity, with no ledger and no calendar, guided instead by instinct sharpened over countless generations into something that looks, from the outside, remarkably close to good judgment. Caching, it turns out, is not a random scatter of food thrown into whatever hole happens to be nearby. Field studies tracking marked nuts have found that squirrels tend to sort their caches by type, burying acorns in one general area and hickory nuts or walnuts in another, rather than mixing them indiscriminately across the same patch of ground. This sorting appears to follow the different decay rates and nutritional profiles of each nut type, since some varieties spoil faster than others or carry more fat and calories per bite. By keeping types loosely separated, a squirrel may be organizing its future search, the same way a person might separate canned goods from fresh produce when stocking a pantry. Not because any single item demands it, but because grouping makes the whole system easier to manage later. This kind of behavioral sorting was not something researchers expected to find in early studies of caching, and its discovery pushed scientific understanding of squirrel cognition further than a simple bury and forget model would allow. It suggests planning that extends beyond a single moment of hiding food into an organized system built for retrieval efficiency months down the line. A pantry with no shelves and no labels, sorted anyway purely by memory and habit, sitting quietly underground across an entire season, waiting for a mind small enough to fit in your palm to come looking for it again. Come winter, when a foot of snow has erased every surface landmark a squirrel relied on in October, the value of that earlier sorting becomes clearer. If related nut types cluster loosely together rather than scattering entirely at random, a squirrel searching a general area for food has better odds of success, even when its memory of the exact spot has grown fuzzy with time. Rather than needing to recall thousands of pinpoint locations with perfect precision, the animal may instead be relying on a coarser, more forgiving system, remembering general zones rich in one type of food or another, then narrowing the search once it arrives. This would explain part of why recovery rates hold up reasonably well even through hard winters, despite the obvious difficulty of finding anything buried under snow and frozen ground. It is a strategy that trades some precision for resilience, a hedge against the imperfection of memory itself. Anyone who has ever organized a garage or a kitchen drawer by category, rather than trying to remember the exact location of every single item, understands the underlying logic instinctively. Grouping reduces the cognitive load of the search. A squirrel appears to have arrived at a similar solution, not through deliberate reasoning in the way a person plans a pantry, but through a behavior shaped by generations of winters that punished poor searchers and rewarded efficient ones. Anyone who has filled a bird feeder, stepped inside for a cup of coffee, and returned to find it hanging empty, already knows this fact from first-hand frustration, rather than from a research paper. A determined squirrel, once it has located a feeder and worked out how to reach it, can clear a standard feeder of seed in well under 10 minutes. Sometimes in a fraction of that time if the design offers no real resistance. The animal does not eat all of that seed on the spot. Much of it gets carried off in cheek pouches, transported to nearby caching sites, and buried for later use, meaning a single raid can see dozens of hidden stores scattered across the surrounding yard. For homeowners, this often plays out as a recurring seasonal standoff feeder. Refilled feeder, emptied, new deterrent, purchased deterrent, eventually defeated. It is a small, familiar domestic battle many people this generation know well, right up there with a garden fence that never quite does its job or a trash can lid that mysteriously ends up 3 yards away by morning. The squirrel, for its part, is not being spiteful or destructive in any deliberate sense. It has simply identified a reliable, concentrated food source and is doing what its entire biology is built to do, moving fast, gathering efficiently, and disappearing before anyone can complain about it directly. The backyard standoff between homeowner and squirrel turns out to have a serious scientific side. Researchers studying animal cognition have run formal experiments specifically using bird feeders and puzzle-style food boxes, testing how squirrels approach mechanical obstacles designed to block easy access to food. In these studies, squirrels consistently demonstrated persistence, trial and error, problem-solving, and a clear capacity to remember which techniques worked once a solution was found. One well-known series of experiments filmed for both scientific and public audiences showed squirrels working through multi-step obstacle courses, including levers, latches, and moving platforms to reach a reward, often solving problems considerably more complex than a typical squirrel-proof feeder sold in stores. What looks like stubborn nuisance behavior in a backyard setting is under laboratory conditions recognized as genuine problem-solving, comparable in some respects to tasks used to study intelligence in other mammals. The squirrel does not memorize a single fixed solution and stop there either. When researchers changed the mechanism partway through testing, many squirrels adapted their approach rather than repeating a strategy that no longer worked. That flexibility adjusting technique when the first attempt fails is a meaningful marker of cognitive ability. And it explains with some precision why so many commercially marketed squirrel-proof feeders end up empty within days of being installed in an ordinary American backyard. Long before human neighborhoods and bird feeders entered the picture, squirrels were already an ancient success story, stretching back tens of millions of years with a fossil record, placing early relatives of the family in North America, during the age when much of the continent still looked unrecognizable compared to today. From that early foothold, squirrels and their close relatives spread outward until members of the family established themselves on every continent except Antarctica, adapting to deserts, mountain ranges, dense tropical forest, and open grassland alike. Few mammal families can claim that kind of geographic reach, while maintaining a recognizably similar basic body plan across such enormous stretches of time and space. Dinosaurs came and went. Ice ages advanced and retreated across entire continents. Through all of it, some version of the squirrel kept finding a way to persist, adjusting its size, its habits, and its habitat preferences without abandoning the core traits that made the design work in the first place. That kind of staying power says something significant about the underlying efficiency of the squirrel's basic template. An animal built simply enough to adapt endlessly, yet specialized enough in key areas, memory, agility, dexterity, to outcompete plenty of animals that seemed on paper far better, suited to survive the same span of changing world conditions. Fossil specimens of early squirrel relatives dating back tens of millions of years already show the recognizable proportions familiar to anyone who has watched one dart across a lawn today. A lightweight frame, grasping paws, a long balancing tail, and forward-facing incisors built for gnawing. This is a striking case of evolutionary stability. Since most mammal lineages from that same distant era have since branched, shrunk, grown, or vanished, entirely reshaped repeatedly by shifting climates and changing predators, squirrels by comparison arrived early at a body plan efficient enough that natural selection saw little reason to overhaul it dramatically since. Small refinements accumulated over time, adjustments in size, coat, and habitat-specific traits like the flying squirrel's gliding membrane, but the essential architecture stayed intact across an almost unimaginable stretch of time. In a sense, watching a squirrel navigate a modern telephone wire is not so different from imagining a distant ancestor navigating a prehistoric branch millions of years earlier, doing essentially the same job with essentially the same tools. That continuity is rare in the animal kingdom and speaks directly to how well suited the underlying design was from a very early point. Sometimes the simplest solution really does turn out to be the most durable one, outlasting far more elaborate evolutionary experiments that ultimately failed to hold up nearly as well. Step back from the individual facts for a moment, and the pattern becomes hard to ignore. Falls that should injure but rarely do. 10,000 buried decisions made from memory alone. Deliberate deception aimed at protecting hidden resources. Sorted, organized caching designed for efficient future retrieval. None of this fits comfortably with the mental shorthand most people carry for squirrels. An animal reduced in casual conversation to little more than a nuisance that raids feeders and digs up flower bulbs. Yet, serious research into squirrel cognition and behavior has expanded significantly in recent decades, driven partly by the animal's convenient proximity to universities and research labs, and partly by growing scientific interest in the underlying question these behaviors raise: how much complex cognition might be hiding inside brains long dismissed as too small or too simple to warrant close study. Each new study seems to peel back another layer of complexity, revealing planning, memory, and even social reasoning in an animal most people walk past without a second glance every single day. That gap between assumption and reality is not a minor curiosity. It is a genuine scientific story, still actively being written with new findings, published regularly enough that any confident summary risks being outdated within a few years, which is itself a sign of just how alive this particular corner of animal behavior research remains. Here, then, is the real shape of the animal at the center of this story. Outwardly common, easy to overlook, present in nearly every yard, park, and wooded lot across the country. Familiar enough to blend into the background of daily life, without a second thought. Underneath that unremarkable surface sits a creature whose body defies expected limits on falling, whose memory organizes thousands of hidden decisions across an entire season, and whose behavior includes deliberate deception aimed at outwitting its own neighbors. That gap between the ordinary exterior and the genuinely strange biology underneath is not a coincidence worth glossing over. It is the entire reason this particular animal rewards a closer look rather than a passing glance out a kitchen window. What follows moves deeper into that gap, starting with the squirrel's own body joints, tail, teeth, and senses, built with a precision easy to miss until it is explained plainly. From there, this account turns toward the intelligence behind the behavior already glimpsed here, before finally reaching the sheer scale of what one small animal multiplied across a population and a continent actually adds up to. The backyard squirrel, it turns out, has never been quite as simple as it looks. Watch a squirrel come down a tree trunk sometime and pay close attention to its hind feet rather than its face, and something strange becomes obvious almost immediately. The rear ankle joint twists itself nearly all the way around, close to a full 180 degrees, allowing the hind paws to point backward relative to the direction the body is traveling. No comparable range of motion exists in the human ankle, which is built for stability underfoot rather than dramatic rotation, and any attempt to force a human joint through a similar range would result in torn ligaments rather than a graceful descent. In the squirrel, this extreme flexibility is not an injury waiting to happen. It is a deliberate anatomical feature present from birth, engineered specifically to solve one particular problem: how to climb down a vertical surface without losing grip or control. The joint itself is reinforced and structured to handle repeated extreme rotation without the kind of wear that would cripple most other mammals attempting the same motion daily. This single adaptation, easy to miss unless you are specifically looking for it, quietly separates squirrels from most other tree-dwelling mammals and sets up one of the more genuinely strange pieces of engineering hidden inside an animal most people assume they already understand completely. Because that ankle joint can rotate so dramatically, a squirrel descending a tree headfirst can plant its hind claws into the bark, facing backward, essentially gripping the trunk from underneath rather than from above, the way its front paws do while climbing up. This backward grip is what allows the animal to descend at speed headfirst without sliding or losing purchase. A maneuver that would be physically impossible without that specialized ankle rotation working in tandem with sharp, curved rear claws. Most climbing mammals lacking this adaptation are forced to descend tail first, backing down slowly and cautiously, unable to see where their hind feet are landing. A squirrel skips that entire cautious process, flipping its body orientation partway down a trunk and continuing headfirst with full visual awareness of the ground and surroundings below. This matters enormously for an animal that spends much of its life reacting to sudden threats, since a squirrel startled near the top of a tree can descend immediately in the fastest, most direct posture available, rather than pausing to reposition first. It is a small mechanical detail with large consequences, transforming an ordinary climbing mammal into one capable of fast, controlled, headfirst vertical travel, a genuinely rare skill among mammals of similar size and one easy to take for granted until you understand precisely what the body is doing. To make it possible, it is worth sitting with the human comparison a little longer, since it puts the squirrel's flexibility into proper context, rather than leaving it as an abstract number. A typical human ankle moves through perhaps 45 to 60 degrees. Total range in the direction relevant here, more than enough for walking, running, and most everyday movement. But nowhere close to the near total reversal a squirrel's hind ankle achieves routinely. Push a human ankle anywhere near that squirrel-level rotation, and the result is torn ligaments, damaged tendons, and very likely a trip to the emergency room rather than a graceful headfirst descent down anything. This is not a matter of squirrels simply being more flexible in a general sense, the way a gymnast trains, flexibility through practice and repetition. The squirrel's joint is structurally different at a fundamental level built from birth, with a range of motion that would represent catastrophic injury in a joint shaped like a human's. That distinction between practice flexibility and structurally different anatomy matters, because it highlights just how specifically this feature was shaped by evolutionary pressure over time, refined generation after generation until the squirrel's rear ankle became something closer to a specialized tool than a general-purpose joint. Nature did not simply make squirrels bendier. It rebuilt a joint from the ground up to serve one very particular, very demanding purpose. Measure a typical gray squirrel from the tip of its nose to the base of its tail, and you get a body somewhere in the range of 9 to 10 inches. Measure the tail itself, and the number comes out remarkably close to that same figure, often nearly matching the length of the body it is attached to. Few mammals carry an appendage proportionally this large relative to their overall size, and none of that length is wasted or purely decorative. A tail this substantial demands real energy to grow, maintain, and carry around constantly, which means evolution would not have preserved anything close to this size unless it earned its keep through genuine functional value. And it does repeatedly across nearly every part of the squirrel's daily life. A fact this account will return to across several of the following passages. For now, simply picture the proportion itself, an appendage, roughly doubling the animal's effective length, trailing behind or curled overhead depending on the moment, constantly in motion, constantly doing something useful. It is easy to glance at a squirrel's tail and register it as simply a fluffy decorative flourish. The kind of detail that makes the animal look a little more charming perched on a fence post. The truth underneath that impression turns out to be considerably more calculated than charming alone would suggest. During a leap between branches, a squirrel's body rotates and shifts in the air in ways that would send a less well-equipped animal spinning out of control before it ever reached its landing point. The tail solves this problem through rapid counterbalancing, flicking, and curving in the opposite direction of any unwanted body rotation, functioning much like the weighted pole a tightrope walker carries to maintain balance mid-crossing. High-speed video analysis of squirrels leaping between branches shows the tail moving independently and rapidly throughout each jump, constantly adjusting to keep the body's center of mass stable and properly oriented for landing. Without this constant correction, the kind of acrobatic branch-to-branch travel squirrels perform routinely several times a minute during active foraging would become dramatically less reliable, with far more missed landings and dangerous falls. The tail essentially functions as a real-time stabilizing rudder reacting to each leap's specific physics rather than following a fixed repeated motion. This is precise, responsive, mechanical control, happening dozens of times, an hour every single day in an animal most people assume is simply lucky or naturally graceful. Luck has very little to do with it. What looks like effortless grace from a distance is up close, a continuously adjusting balancing act performed by a specialized appendage built specifically for exactly this purpose. On a hot summer afternoon, a squirrel resting on a tree limb will often curl its tail up and over its own back, angling it like a small parasol positioned directly between its body and the sun overhead. This is a genuine thermoregulatory behavior, documented by researchers studying how squirrels manage body heat during warm weather. And it works because the tail's dense fur creates effective shade without requiring the animal to retreat into a burrow or den and lose valuable foraging time. Unlike sweating, which squirrels do only minimally through limited sweat glands, this kind of behavioral shading costs almost nothing in terms of water or energy, while still meaningfully reducing direct solar exposure on hot days. It is a remarkably simple solution to a real physiological problem, using a body part already present for entirely different purposes, and repurposing it seasonally for climate control. Anyone who has ever propped a golf umbrella against a lawn chair on a bright afternoon has already grasped the basic logic: instinctively shade brought along, rather than shade found. The squirrel simply carries its own permanently attached, ready for deployment the moment the sun gets uncomfortable. It is a small detail easy to miss entirely unless you happen to be watching closely on exactly the right kind of sweltering afternoon, but it reveals a tail doing serious functional work well beyond balance and communication alone. Reverse the season, and that same tail takes on an entirely different job. During cold weather, a squirrel resting or sleeping in its nest will often wrap its tail around its own body, using the dense fur as insulation, much the way a person might pull a blanket up over exposed shoulders on a chilly night. This behavior helps trap body heat close to the torso. reducing overall heat loss during rest periods when the animal's metabolism naturally slows and generates less warmth than active movement would provide. The same physical trait, thick, dense fur along an oversized tail that provides shade in summer heat, provides insulation in winter cold. A dual-purpose design that adapts its function entirely based on the season rather than requiring two separate physical solutions. Few pieces of animal anatomy manage that kind of complete functional reversal using the exact same physical structure. It would be roughly equivalent to owning a single piece of outdoor gear that worked perfectly as both a sunshade and a winter parka, depending entirely on how you positioned it. No redesign required, no separate purchase needed for opposite season. The squirrel carries that adaptable tool permanently attached, adjusting its use instinctively as temperatures shift throughout the year, extracting maximum practical value from a single, remarkably versatile body part that most casual observers never credit with doing nearly this much genuine functional work. Beyond balance and temperature control, a squirrel's tail carries out a third distinct job as a communication tool. When a squirrel spots a potential threat, a hawk overhead, an approaching dog, an unfamiliar animal moving through the territory, it will often flick its tail in sharp, repeated motions, sometimes paired with a vocal chattering call and sometimes performed silently on its own. Other squirrels within visual range pick up on that flicking motion, immediately treating it as a warning sign worth responding to, even without hearing any accompanying sound. This visual signal matters particularly in situations where vocal alarm calls might not carry far enough or where staying silent offers a safety advantage against a predator that hunts partly by sound. Researchers studying squirrel behavior have documented distinct differences in tail flicking patterns depending on the type of threat detected, suggesting the signal may carry more specific information than a simple generic warning. A single tail then ends up serving three entirely separate biological functions across balance, climate control, and communication, each one activated situationally, depending on what the moment actually calls for. That level of functional range packed into one appendage is genuinely rare across the animal kingdom, and it is easy to walk past a squirrel flicking its tail on a fence post without ever suspecting you just witnessed a full sentence, delivered in a language built entirely out of motion. Unlike human teeth, which reach a fixed size in adulthood and then simply wear down slowly over decades, a squirrel's front incisors never stop growing for as long as the animal lives. These teeth can grow several inches per year if left completely unchecked, a pace that would eventually make eating or even closing the mouth physically impossible without some kind of ongoing correction. This continuous growth is a shared trait across all rodents, squirrels included, and it exists because rodent incisors experience constant wear from the very behavior that defines the entire order, near constant gnawing on hard materials like wood nutshells and other tough plant matter, rather than fighting against that wear with teeth built to simply endure it the way human enamel does. Squirrels, instead, lean entirely into continuous replacement, growing new material fast enough to offset whatever gets worn away through daily use. It is a fundamentally different biological strategy than the one human teeth rely on, prioritizing constant renewal over static durability. This detail alone reframes something people often observe without fully understanding. The sight of a squirrel gnawing steadily on a nut, a piece of bark, or occasionally something considerably less appropriate like a wooden porch railing. That gnawing was never optional behavior or simple preference. It is biological maintenance performed daily, keeping a permanently growing tool at a precisely usable length. The relationship between growth and wear in a squirrel's incisors operates as a finely tuned balance rather than a one-directional process. As the teeth grow continuously from the base, regular gnawing wears down the exposed tips at a roughly matching pace, keeping overall tooth length stable within a narrow functional range across the animal's entire lifetime. This balance is not something the squirrel consciously manages or thinks about in any deliberate sense. It emerges naturally from instinctive gnawing behavior combined with the physical reality of tooth structure, hard enamel on the front surface, paired with softer material behind it, which wears at an angle that naturally maintains a sharp, chisel-like cutting edge as the tooth grinds against itself during normal eating and gnawing activity. This self-sharpening effect means a squirrel's teeth do not just stay a consistent length, they stay consistently sharp as well, without any external tool or filing process required. It is a remarkably self-sufficient system, essentially a built-in maintenance cycle running continuously in the background of the animal's daily routine, invisible unless something disrupts it. Most squirrels never experience tooth trouble in the wild, specifically because the system works so reliably on its own growth and wear, locked together in a balance, refined over millions of years of evolutionary pressure, requiring nothing more from the animal than its ordinary everyday habit of chewing on whatever happens to be within reach. That finely tuned balance between growth and wear only holds up as long as a squirrel has consistent access to hard material worth gnawing on. Remove that access, as sometimes happens with captive rodents, kept on soft diets without proper enrichment, and the entire system breaks down quickly. Incisors continue growing at their normal rate, regardless of whether wear keeps pace. And within a matter of weeks, untreated overgrowth can reach a point where the upper and lower teeth no longer meet correctly, sometimes curving inward toward the mouth or even piercing surrounding tissue. In severe cases, veterinarians who treat small mammals see this condition regularly enough that it has a name: malocclusion, and it stands as one of the more sobering illustrations of just how much daily, active gnawing genuinely matters to a rodent's basic survival, rather than serving as optional behavior. In the wild, a healthy squirrel never faces this particular danger since its environment supplies an endless rotating menu of nuts, bark, and hard-shelled food that keeps the growth and wear cycle balanced automatically without any conscious effort involved. The condition mostly reveals itself as a cautionary edge case, useful precisely because it shows what happens when one half of a two-part biological system gets removed. Growth alone, unchecked by wear, does not lead anywhere good, a detail that quietly underscores just how essential that constant gnawing habit truly is to the animal's entire way of life. Look closely at a squirrel's face sometime rather than simply registering it as a small, furry blur darting across a lawn, and the eye placement stands out as genuinely unusual. Rather than sitting forward on the face the way human eyes do, positioned for sharp, focused depth perception directly ahead, a squirrel's eyes sit high on the skull and pushed noticeably toward the sides, almost approaching the positioning seen in animals like horses or rabbits. This placement was not a random developmental quirk. It reflects a clear evolutionary trade-off, prioritizing an extremely wide field of view over the kind of narrow, precise binocular vision that would help judge exact distances directly in front of the animal. For a creature spending much of its life watching for predators approaching from any direction above, behind, or from either side, that wide field of vision offers a genuine survival advantage difficult to overstate. A hawk diving from directly overhead, a fox approaching from behind a tree trunk, both become detectable through peripheral vision alone, often before the threat closes enough distance to become dangerous. The trade-off costs something real, in exchange a cost worth examining honestly, rather than glossing over, since evolutionary solutions rarely arrive without some kind of sacrifice attached to the benefit they provide. The practical payoff of that wide-set eye placement is a field of view stretching close to a full circle around the animal's head, with only a narrow blind zone requiring any turn of the neck to cover completely. For an animal near the middle of the food chain, hunted by hawks, owls, foxes, snakes, and domestic cats alike, this kind of near-panoramic awareness functions as a constant, low-effort security system running in the background of every single moment spent above ground. A squirrel does not need to stop, turn, and scan deliberately the way a person checking for traffic before crossing a street would. Most of the surrounding environment is already visible simply by virtue of where its eyes sit on its skull, requiring only small adjustments to bring a detected movement into sharper focus. This explains part of why squirrels appear so consistently alert and quick to react, freezing, bolting, or dashing for cover at the faintest hint of movement nearby. They are not being unusually skittish or overly anxious by nature. They are running highly effective threat detection nearly all day, every day, using a visual system purpose-built for exactly that job. It is a design choice that trades away some precision directly ahead in exchange for something arguably more valuable to a small prey animal: the ability to see danger coming from almost any direction before it ever gets dangerously close. Every design choice carries a cost, and the squirrel's wide panoramic vision is no exception. With eyes pushed so far toward the sides of the skull, the animal loses a meaningful amount of binocular overlap directly in front of its own face, creating a genuine blind spot in the exact area most animals rely on for precise, close-range judgment. This is part of why squirrels are frequently observed tilting their heads at odd angles while examining a nut held close to their mouth, or approaching a piece of food with small adjusting movements rather than reaching directly and confidently toward it. The animal is compensating in real time for a visual gap directly ahead, relying more heavily on touch whiskers and small head movements to judge exact distance and position for anything held very close to the face. It is a genuinely elegant trade-off when considered as a complete system, rather than a flaw in isolation. Wide peripheral awareness, purchased at the cost of some precision immediately in front of the nose. A sacrifice well worth making for an animal whose greatest daily threat rarely approaches from straight ahead in full view. Understanding this blind spot also reframes something easy to otherwise misread as clumsiness, that slightly fumbling head-tilting way a squirrel handles food up close. It is not clumsiness at all. It is a visual system doing its honest best with a gap built directly into its own design. Most people picture whiskers as strictly a facial feature, and on a squirrel that assumption only tells part of the story. In addition to the whiskers surrounding its nose and mouth, a squirrel also carries specialized sensory whiskers on its forelimbs and wrists, positioned to detect nearby surfaces, branches, and obstacles, even when visual information is limited or unavailable entirely. This matters enormously for an animal that spends significant time moving through dense branches, tight tree cavities, and low-light conditions at dawn, dusk, or inside dark nest hollows situations, where relying on eyesight alone would leave dangerous gaps in spatial awareness. These limb whiskers function essentially as an early warning touch system, brushing against nearby surfaces microseconds before a paw makes contact, feeding the brain immediate information about texture, distance, and obstacle position that helps guide precise, confident movement even in near-total darkness. It is a sensory redundancy most people never think to look for, tucked away on a body part that seems at a glance entirely unremarkable. Combined with the wide-angle vision covering nearly every direction, and the near-constant vigilance that vision supports, these limb whiskers round out a genuinely sophisticated sensory package, one built from multiple overlapping systems working together rather than any single sense, carrying the full burden alone. Small animal layered defenses, each one quietly doing its share of the work. Among the squirrel family's more dramatic anatomical solutions belongs to a close cousin of the familiar backyard gray squirrel, the flying squirrel, which does not actually fly in the way a bird does, but instead glides using a specialized stretch of skin called the patagium. This membrane stretches along both sides of the body, connecting the wrist of each front limb to the ankle of the corresponding hind limb, creating a continuous furred surface that, when the limbs spread wide, transforms the animal's silhouette into something resembling a small living detail. Launching from a high branch, a flying squirrel extends all four limbs simultaneously, pulling the patagium taut, and glides outward and downward across distances that can stretch remarkably far relative to the animal's small size, adjusting its trajectory mid-flight through subtle shifts in limb position and tail angle. This is not powered flight in any true sense, since there is no flapping motion generating lift the way a bird's wings do, but it represents a genuinely sophisticated aerial adaptation nonetheless, allowing the animal to cover distances between trees that would otherwise require a slow, exposed, and far more dangerous journey down one trunk and back up another. It stands as one of the more visually striking anatomical variations found anywhere within the broader squirrel family. A body plan repurposed almost entirely for a completely different mode of travel. Picture the patagium stretched fully open mid-glide, and the comparison to a kite becomes almost literal rather than merely descriptive. The membrane creates a continuous curved surface running the entire length of the animal's outstretched body, catching air in essentially the same way fabric stretched across a kite frame does, generating enough lift and drag to convert what would otherwise be a straight vertical fall into a controlled extended downward glide covering significant horizontal distance. Some flying squirrels have been documented gliding well over 100 feet in a single launch, covering roughly the length of an entire football field measured end to end, all without a single flap or any form of active propulsion beyond the initial push off a high branch. Steering happens through small, continuous adjustments, subtle shifts in limb tension and tail positioning that change the membrane's angle and curvature mid-flight, allowing the animal to bank gently around obstacles or adjust its landing point as it approaches a target tree. Landing itself involves flaring the whole body upward at the last moment, using the membrane and tail together to slow down sharply before all four limbs grip the new trunk. It is a complete self-contained aerial system, evolved gradually over a long span of time, allowing one branch of the squirrel family to solve the problem of covering distance in an entirely different way than its ground-bound and tree-climbing relatives ever needed to. In a genuinely surprising and quite recent scientific discovery, researchers using ultraviolet light to examine museum specimens as part of an unrelated project found that fluoresce a vivid pink color when exposed to that Light, a trait invisible entirely under ordinary daylight conditions. The finding, published in the scientific literature and quickly picked up by wildlife researchers across multiple institutions, came as a genuine surprise, since this kind of fluorescence had never been documented in this particular group of mammals. Before that point, despite the species having been studied extensively for well over a century. Follow-up observations confirmed the effect across multiple flying squirrel species and museum specimens, ruling out contamination or an isolated fluke and establishing UV fluorescence as a real, if previously unnoticed biological trait, belonging to this branch of the squirrel family. What makes this discovery particularly striking is not simply the color itself, but the reminder it delivers about how much remains genuinely unknown, even about animals that seem on the surface thoroughly documented and well understood. A trait this visually dramatic sat completely undetected for generations of careful scientific study, hidden simply because nobody had thought to examine ordinary museum specimens under the right kind of light. Sometimes major discoveries require nothing more exotic than a different lens pointed at something that has been sitting in plain sight the entire time. Discovering the fluorescence itself turned out to be considerably easier than explaining why it exists in the first place, and that question remains genuinely unresolved within the scientific community studying it. Several competing hypotheses have emerged since the initial discovery, each with some supporting logic, but none yet confirmed as the definitive answer. Some researchers suggest the glow might play a role in communication or mate recognition, particularly relevant for a nocturnal animal that does much of its gliding and foraging after dark, when normal visual signals would be far less useful than they are for daytime animals. Others propose the fluorescence could serve as a form of camouflage against certain predators, since some owls, a major predator of flying squirrels, are known to see ultraviolet light themselves, meaning the glow might blend into a UV-reflective forest backdrop rather than standing out as a conspicuous fluorescence to human observers. Happen to objective notice. Still others remain cautious about assigning any adaptive purpose at all, suggesting the fluorescence could simply be an incidental byproduct of certain skin or fur compounds rather than a trait actively shaped by natural selection for a specific function. This kind of open, unresolved debate is not a weakness in the science. It is exactly how genuine scientific inquiry looks, while still actively in progress, a real question with real competing answers, none of them settled yet with full confidence. Step back again, as this account did once before, and consider everything covered since that last pause. A hind ankle capable of near-total rotation, purpose-built for head-first descent. A tail serving 3 entirely separate functions: balance, temperature regulation, and silent communication, each one activated depending on the moment's specific need. Teeth locked in a permanent, self-sustaining balance between constant growth and constant wear. Eyes positioned for near-total peripheral awareness at the direct cost of precision immediately ahead. Whiskers extending sensory awareness beyond the face and onto the limbs themselves. And within one dramatic branch of the family, an entire membrane repurposed for genuine aerial travel, carrying a fluorescent trait discovered only recently and still not fully explained. None of these features exist in isolation. Together, they describe a body engineered with remarkable specificity for the exact life this animal actually leads, rather than a generic all-purpose mammalian template applied loosely across the board. That level of precision, hidden beneath fur whiskers, and a shape familiar enough to earn barely a glance from most people walking past one on any given afternoon, sets up the next and arguably more surprising layer of this story. Because a body this carefully built naturally raises a further question: what kind of mind is actually directing it moment to moment, decision to decision? Return now to a behavior this account touched on briefly near the very beginning, the fake burial, and look at it properly this time, with the full scientific weight behind it. Researchers studying fox squirrels and gray squirrels in controlled observational settings set out specifically to determine whether the deceptive caching anecdotally reported by casual observers held up under rigorous scientific scrutiny. Using marked animals, controlled food sources, and careful behavioral tracking across repeated trials, the resulting research confirmed the behavior definitively published in peer-reviewed scientific literature, rather than left as folklore passed between backyard birdwatchers. Squirrels genuinely do perform decoy burials, digging, covering, and patting down empty holes with no food ever placed inside. And they do so at a measurably higher rate, specifically when another animal is present and appears to be paying attention. This distinction between casual anecdote and controlled scientific confirmation matters considerably, since animal behavior research has a long history of overinterpreting cute or clever-seeming actions that later turn out to have simpler explanations once properly tested. Deceptive caching cleared that bar. It held up under formal study repeated across multiple research teams and experimental conditions, and stands today as one of the more solidly established examples of complex, context-sensitive behavior documented in any rodent species, squirrel or otherwise. The precision of this behavior is what makes it genuinely remarkable rather than simply odd. Squirrels do not perform decoy burials constantly as a fixed automatic habit triggered every single time they cache food. Instead, the behavior appears selectively, correlating directly with the presence of an observing animal nearby, whether that observer is another squirrel or in laboratory settings. Even a human researcher positioned within clear sight of the caching squirrel. Remove the observer entirely, let the squirrel cache in genuine privacy, and the rate of decoy burials drops substantially with the animal, instead performing straightforward, honest caching most of the time. This selective triggering is the detail researchers found most significant since a fixed, unconditional behavior would suggest simple instinct running on autopilot, regardless of circumstance, while a conditional behavior activated specifically by the presence of a potential witness suggests something considerably more sophisticated happening internally. The squirrel appears to be assessing its situation in real time, registering whether it is being watched, and adjusting its own behavior accordingly to manage the consequences of that observation. That kind of situational awareness, responding differently depending on who might be watching, represents a meaningfully higher order of behavioral complexity than simple reflexive instinct, and it forms the foundation for an even bigger question researchers have since started asking directly. Consider what decoy burying actually requires the animal to understand, even at a very basic level. To fake a burial convincingly enough to fool a watching rival, a squirrel must in some sense grasp that the other animal is currently observing its actions, and that convincingly mimicking a real burial will lead that observer to form a false belief about where food is actually located. This is a meaningfully different cognitive task than simply reacting to a present threat or stimulus. It involves modeling at some level what is happening inside another creature's perception and understanding, then deliberately shaping that understanding through a specific, well-timed action. Human children typically do not reliably demonstrate this kind of reasoning, understanding that others can hold false beliefs different from reality, until somewhere around 3 or 4 years of age, a developmental milestone considered significant enough in human psychology to be studied extensively in its own right. Finding behavior that at least resembles this same underlying logic in a small rodent, whose brain bears little structural resemblance to a human child's developing mind, raised serious scientific eyebrows when first documented clearly. It does not necessarily mean squirrels think about deception the exact way a person does, but it strongly suggests some functional version of that same underlying capacity deployed instinctively rather than consciously, yet effective all the same. The formal term for this capacity, understanding that another creature holds beliefs or perceptions potentially different from one's own reality, is theory of mind, a concept originally developed and studied almost exclusively within primate research focused heavily on chimpanzees, and within human developmental psychology. For decades, theory of mind was treated by much of the scientific community as a hallmark of unusually advanced cognition, largely restricted to humans and perhaps our closest primate relatives, animals with famously large brains relative to body size, and complex, highly social group structures. Squirrel research complicated that assumption considerably. While researchers remain appropriately cautious about overstating the comparison, since squirrel cognition clearly differs in significant ways from primate cognition, the deceptive caching behavior documented so consistently does appear to functionally resemble a basic form of theory of mind, or at minimum a behavioral strategy that produces the same practical outcome without necessarily requiring identical underlying mental machinery. This finding contributed to a broader ongoing shift within animal cognition research generally, a growing willingness among scientists to look seriously for sophisticated cognitive capacities in animals previously dismissed as too small-brained or too evolutionarily distant from humans to bother studying closely. The humble backyard squirrel, in this sense, has become an unlikely but genuinely important participant in one of the more interesting ongoing conversations in modern animal behavior science. Return to the practical mechanics of memory itself, and the scale involved becomes clearer with specific detail attached. Months after burying a nut in October, often under changed conditions entirely. Fallen leaves decomposed, snow melted, and refrozen multiple times. Entire seasons of weather, reshaping the visible landscape. A squirrel can still return to that precise spot and dig successfully, locating food it buried long before any of those changes occurred. This recovery relies overwhelmingly on spatial memory rather than scent, since researchers testing this specifically have found squirrels can locate their own caches at rates well above what smell-based searching alone would explain. Particularly once buried nuts have had time to lose most of their surface scent to weather and soil absorption. The squirrel is in effect drawing on an internal cognitive map, built and updated continuously over an entire season, cross-referencing remembered landmarks, distances, and directional cues against its current surroundings, to zero in on a specific previously chosen location. Try to imagine performing this same task yourself, recalling the exact spot where you buried something small in your own backyard 8 months earlier, guided by memory alone, with the landscape changed considerably since. Most people would fail this test rather badly. A squirrel working from a brain smaller than a walnut succeeds at it often enough to survive an entire winter, doing exactly that repeatedly without a single written note. Spatial memory in squirrels does not appear to function as a single isolated skill, but rather as an integrated system drawing on multiple overlapping types of information simultaneously. Visual landmarks play a significant role, with squirrels reportedly using nearby trees, rocks, fence posts, and other fixed environmental features as reference points, anchoring each cache location within a broader mental map. Residual scent, though weaker and less reliable over long time spans than fresh burial sites, likely still contributes some supplementary information, particularly for caches recovered relatively soon after burial, before weather has erased surface odor. And, perhaps most interestingly, researchers studying squirrel movement patterns have found evidence suggesting the animals may also rely on a kind of remembered path integration, essentially tracking their own movement direction and distance, traveled from a known starting point, then using that internally tracked information to help reconstruct exactly where a particular cache sits relative to their current position. Combining several distinct types of information this way builds considerable redundancy into the system, meaning the failure or degradation of any single input faded scent. A fallen landmark tree does not necessarily doom the entire search effort. It is a resilient, layered approach to memory and navigation, considerably more sophisticated than a single simple mechanism, and it helps explain why squirrel cache recovery holds up reasonably well even across genuinely difficult seasonal rain conditions. Not every buried nut gets reclaimed, and that imperfection, rather than representing pure failure, turns out to carry enormous ecological significance, discussed later in fuller detail. A meaningful percentage of caches, varying by study season and local conditions, simply never get recovered, whether due to the squirrel's death, a genuinely forgotten location, competing priorities elsewhere, or sheer environmental disruption to the original burial site. Left undisturbed in the ground through winter and into spring, a forgotten acorn or hickory nut sits in nearly ideal conditions for germination, buried at an appropriate depth, often in loose aerated soil, recently disturbed by the burial process itself. Come spring, some meaningful share of these forgotten caches sprout into seedlings entirely by accident, an unintended byproduct of one small animal's imperfect memory system. This detail transforms an apparent weakness, incomplete cache recovery, into something closer to an accidental ecological service, performed at enormous scale across an entire forest ecosystem. A topic this account will return to with considerably more depth once the full scope of a population's combined caching activity comes into clearer focus. For now, simply hold on to the irony embedded here, that the squirrel's very imperfection as a hoarder, its failure to remember everything perfectly, may be quietly responsible for growing a meaningful share of the forest it depends on for its own future survival. Measuring something as inherently hidden as buried food recovery required researchers to develop clever field methods capable of tracking outcomes without disturbing the natural behavior being studied. One common approach involves attaching small, harmless tags or markers, sometimes tiny threads, sometimes chemically treated nuts, detectable with specialized equipment, to a batch of nuts before squirrels bury them, then periodically checking which tagged nuts remain in place versus which have been dug up and presumably consumed or relocated. Other studies have used direct observational tracking, following individually marked squirrels across an entire season and recording both burial locations and subsequent recovery attempts, successful or otherwise, building a detailed picture of real-world recovery rates under natural field conditions rather than artificial laboratory setups. These methods, while labor-intensive and requiring considerable patience from the researchers involved, spending entire seasons quite literally watching squirrels dig, have produced the actual data underlying most of what science currently understands about cache recovery rates and spatial memory performance in this animal. It is worth appreciating, if only briefly, the sheer dedication required to generate this kind of research, tracking thousands of individually marked nuts across sprawling outdoor territories through multiple seasons and weather conditions, all to answer questions about an animal most people walk past without a second thought on any ordinary afternoon. Beyond simple decoy burials, researchers have documented a broader range of strategic adjustments squirrels make, specifically in response to social pressure from watching rivals. A squirrel, aware of nearby competitors, may choose to travel considerably farther from its current position before burying food, effectively putting more distance between the observed starting point and the actual cache location, making it harder for a watching rival to simply walk over and dig in the right spot immediately afterward. Some squirrels have also been observed burying more shallowly and quickly when under observation, prioritizing speed of concealment over the more careful, thorough burial technique used when caching alone and unobserved. Others adjust timing entirely, delaying caching activity until a rival has moved away or become distracted elsewhere in the territory. Taken together, this range of adjustable strategies paints a picture considerably more sophisticated than a single fixed decoy burial behavior alone would suggest. The squirrel appears to draw from something closer to a flexible toolkit of responses, selecting whichever strategy best fits the specific social situation unfolding in that particular moment, rather than defaulting to one rigid, unchanging tactic, regardless of circumstance. That kind of situational flexibility, adjusting the specific method rather than simply switching a single behavior on or off, represents a meaningfully higher level of behavioral sophistication than researchers originally expected to find in this particular animal. The flip side of all this defensive caching strategy is straightforward theft, and it happens often enough to explain much of why the defensive behavior evolved as robustly as it did in the first place. Squirrels regularly watch their neighbors bury food, then return later, sometimes within minutes, sometimes after a considerable delay, to dig up and steal caches they had no part in creating themselves. Researchers estimate that a genuinely significant share of all buried caches within a shared territory eventually get pilfered by a different squirrel than the one who originally buried them, turning the entire caching landscape into something closer to a continuously contested shared resource than a simple collection of private, individually secure stockpiles. This creates constant evolutionary pressure, favoring squirrels skilled at protecting their own caches from theft, while simultaneously benefiting from any opportunity to steal from others. A dynamic that likely helped shape both the sophisticated defensive caching strategies already discussed and, quite possibly, the animal's generally sharp memory and observational skills more broadly. It is a genuinely competitive underground economy, playing out constantly, invisible to anyone glancing casually out a window at what looks like a peaceful yard full of squirrels going about their business independently. In reality, every buried nut sits within a much larger ongoing contest of memory, timing, deception, and opportunism unfolding constantly beneath an entirely ordinary suburban surface. Step back and connect these two threads directly because together they form a genuinely compelling piece of evolutionary logic. If theft between squirrels happens as frequently and consistently as field research suggests, then any behavior reducing the odds of losing a cache to a watching rival would carry real, measurable survival value, translating directly into more food surviving through winter, and ultimately better odds of reproducing successfully the following spring. Deceptive caching fits that logic precisely. It costs the deceiving squirrel very little, a few extra seconds of digging and covering an empty hole, while potentially saving considerable stored food from discovery and theft by an observing rival. Over countless generations, squirrels better at reading social situations and deploying convincing decoys would have consistently retained more of their winter food supply than squirrels caching honestly and predictably every single time, regardless of who might be watching. That kind of consistent selective advantage repeated across enormous spans of time is precisely the mechanism through which complex behaviors like this tend to emerge and stabilize within a species. Deceptive caching, in other words, likely was not shaped by any single dramatic evolutionary event, but rather ground out slowly and steadily by the everyday reality of living among constant thieves. Each stolen cache quietly favoring whichever squirrels happened to be just a little better than their neighbors at protecting what they had already worked to bury. Shift focus now toward a different branch of the same broader squirrel family, the prairie dog, a ground-dwelling relative living in large, highly social colonies across the American plains and western grasslands. Where tree squirrels rely heavily on individual memory and largely solitary caching strategies, prairie dogs have instead developed something remarkable in an entirely different direction. One of the most sophisticated vocal alarm systems ever documented in any non-primate animal. Living in dense colonies that can stretch across acres of open grassland, prairie dogs face constant predator pressure from hawks, coyotes, badgers, and snakes. And they have evolved an alarm call system considerably more detailed than the simple generic warning cries found in most other mammals. Rather than issuing one blanket alarm sound, meaning roughly danger, nearby prairie dog calls carry structured specific information about the actual threat itself. A distinction researchers only confirmed through careful acoustic analysis conducted over years of dedicated fieldwork. This discovery placed prairie dogs, and by extension the broader squirrel family they belong to, firmly within a much smaller group of animals recognized for genuinely complex vocal communication, a group that includes some primates and a handful of other highly social species, but relatively few rodents. It is a striking reminder that this family's cognitive sophistication was never limited to the tree-climbing, nut-burying cousins most people picture first. The specificity within prairie dog alarm calls goes well beyond simply signaling that danger exists somewhere nearby. Careful acoustic research has demonstrated that prairie dogs produce measurably different calls depending on the particular type of predator, approaching distinct patterns for a hawk, diving from above a coyote, moving across open ground, or even a human walking through the colony, each triggering its own recognizably different vocal signature. This matters enormously in practical terms, since the correct defensive response differs considerably depending on the specific threat involved. A hawk overhead calls for an immediate dive into the nearest burrow, while a slower-moving ground predator like a coyote might instead call for continued cautious observation from just outside a burrow entrance, ready to retreat quickly, but not necessarily requiring instant full submersion underground. A colony receiving generic, undifferentiated alarm calls would need to react to every warning with the same maximum caution regardless of actual threat level, wasting valuable feeding and foraging time on false alarms triggered by lower-risk situations. Instead, specific calls allow the colony to calibrate its response precisely to the actual danger present in that moment, conserving energy and feeding time whenever the threat genuinely calls for a lesser response. This kind of information-rich signaling tailored specifically to threat type moves prairie dog communication well beyond simple alarm and into something considerably closer to functional descriptive language. The depth of information embedded within prairie dog alarm calls goes further still, based on detailed research published by scientists who spent years recording and analyzing thousands of individual alarm calls under carefully controlled experimental conditions. Using specially designed silhouettes and costumed human volunteers to test how prairie dogs responded to varying threats, researchers found that the resulting alarm calls varied not just by predator species, but by specific physical characteristics of the approaching threat itself, including its approximate size and even its color. A human volunteer wearing a blue shirt reportedly triggered a measurably different call pattern than the same volunteer wearing a yellow shirt. A level of descriptive precision that genuinely surprised even researchers already familiar with prairie dog communication going into the study. This finding pushed prairie dog vocalization into territory previously considered almost exclusively the domain of human language. The capacity to encode specific descriptive details about a novel object or individual within a structured communication signal, rather than simply signaling a fixed, predetermined category of danger. It remains one of the more remarkable findings in the broader field of animal communication research, precisely because it emerged from such an unassuming, easily overlooked animal. A burrowing rodent studied seriously by relatively few researchers compared to the scientific attention regularly directed toward primates, dolphins, or birds, long assumed to be the more obvious candidates for this kind of linguistic sophistication. Given the specificity documented across species, size, and even color, some researchers studying prairie dog communication have begun describing their alarm call system using language typically reserved for genuine linguistic structure, cautiously proposing that it may represent something bordering on a primitive form of language rather than simple instinctive signaling. This remains a genuinely contested claim within the broader scientific community, and it deserves that caution rather than uncritical acceptance, since the word language carries enormous weight and specific technical definitions within linguistics that go well beyond simply conveying detailed information. Critics of the stronger interpretation point out that structured, information-rich signaling does not automatically prove the kind of grammatical generative complexity that defines true language as linguists formally understand it. Supporters counter that the sheer descriptive specificity documented in coding predator type, size, and color within variable call structures meets a meaningfully higher bar than any other known non-primate alarm system, and deserves serious consideration as at least a stepping stone toward understanding how complex communication might evolve from simpler signaling systems. The debate itself remains genuinely unresolved and actively discussed within current animal communication research, without a clear scientific consensus settling the question definitively in either direction. What is not contested, regardless of where any individual researcher lands on the language question specifically, is that prairie dog communication represents something considerably more sophisticated than the simple generic alarm calls found across most of the animal kingdom. Return now to tree squirrels specifically, and to a capacity closely related to the cognitive sophistication already documented elsewhere in this family: social learning. Researchers running puzzle box experiments testing how squirrels solve mechanical obstacles blocking access to food rewards have found that squirrels who first observe another squirrel successfully solving a given puzzle tend to solve that same puzzle considerably faster themselves afterward compared to squirrels given no opportunity to watch a demonstration beforehand. This suggests genuine observational learning at work. The capacity to acquire useful information by watching another individual's actions and outcomes, rather than needing to solve every new problem entirely from scratch through pure individual trial and error each time. Observational learning of this kind carries obvious practical advantages within a shared environment where multiple squirrels regularly encounter the same obstacles. Whether a genuinely difficult natural food source, or increasingly in modern settings, an elaborately engineered bird feeder specifically marketed as squirrel-resistant. One squirrel cracking a difficult mechanism effectively becomes a resource for every other squirrel watching nearby, spreading a useful solution through the local population considerably faster than if each individual animal had to work out the same problem entirely independently. This kind of social transmission of learned solutions, while more commonly associated with primates or certain bird species in casual conversation, turns out to be genuinely present and measurable within squirrel populations as well. The experimental evidence supporting squirrel observational learning comes primarily from controlled maze and puzzle box studies, designed specifically to isolate and measure this capacity under conditions researchers could carefully control and repeat. In typical setups, researchers present a squirrel with a mechanical box containing a visible food reward, accessible only after successfully manipulating some combination of levers, latches, sliding panels, or rotating mechanisms in a specific sequence. Squirrels given no prior exposure to the puzzle generally take considerably longer to solve it through pure trial and error, sometimes failing entirely within the observation window. Squirrels who first watch a trained demonstrator squirrel successfully solve the identical puzzle show measurably faster success rates afterward, often solving the same mechanism correctly on their very first independent attempt, a result difficult to explain through anything other than genuine information transfer gained through observation. Researchers have run variations on this basic design, repeatedly adjusting puzzle complexity, demonstrator familiarity, and viewing conditions, generally finding the core effect holds up reasonably consistently across different experimental setups. This body of research provides considerably more rigorous support for social learning in squirrels than casual backyard observation alone could ever offer, transforming an intuitive assumption that squirrels probably learn something from watching each other into a properly tested, evidence-backed finding published within peer-reviewed behavioral science literature. Shift attention now toward another remarkable capacity found within specific branches of the squirrel family: true hibernation, a physiological feat considerably more extreme than the light winter dormancy many people mistakenly associate with all squirrels generally. While the familiar backyard gray squirrel remains active through winter, relying on its extensive buried food caches rather than hibernating. Several of its relatives, including many ground squirrel species and marmots, undergo genuine deep hibernation, sometimes lasting several months at a stretch through the coldest part of the year. During this extended dormant period, body temperature drops dramatically from a normal, active baseline down to levels that would be dangerously hypothermic, potentially fatal for almost any other active mammal, maintaining consistent warm-blooded function. Metabolic rate similarly plummets, dropping to a small fraction of the animal's normal active baseline. Conserving stored fat reserves across a period when almost no food remains available above ground and outside temperatures would make active foraging both futile and lethally dangerous. This represents an entirely different survival strategy than the tree squirrel's caching approach, trading active winter foraging and food retrieval for a controlled, extended shutdown of nearly all non-essential bodily function, essentially waiting out the harshest months in a state bordering on suspended animation rather than actively working through them. The physiological extremes reached during hibernation in certain ground squirrel species push considerably further than most people would assume possible for any mammal to survive. Researchers studying Arctic ground squirrels specifically have documented core body temperatures dropping to levels just below the standard freezing point of water during peak hibernation. A genuinely startling finding, given that ice crystal formation within blood and living tissue is normally catastrophic, rupturing cells and causing fatal, irreversible damage in almost any other warm-blooded animal pushed anywhere near that same temperature range. Arctic ground squirrels avoid this fate through a specialized biological process called supercooling, in which body fluids remain in a liquid state well below their normal freezing threshold, prevented from actually crystallizing into ice through specific physiological adaptations, still being actively studied and only partially understood. Even today, this capacity places Arctic ground squirrels among a genuinely small handful of mammals known to survive body temperatures this extreme. A physiological feat that has drawn serious scientific attention from researchers well beyond wildlife biology, specifically including medical researchers interested in whether understanding this natural supercooling mechanism might someday inform human medical applications such as improved organ preservation techniques for transplant surgery. An animal weighing barely more than a pound, quietly enduring conditions that would kill most other mammals within minutes, represents one of the more genuinely extreme survival adaptations found anywhere within the entire squirrel family. Alongside that dramatic drop in body temperature, hibernating ground squirrels and marmots undergo an equally dramatic slowdown in heart rate, falling from several hundred beats per minute during normal active periods down to just a handful of beats per minute during the deepest phase of hibernation, sometimes as low as 3 to 5 beats across an entire 60-second span. For comparison, a resting human heart typically beats somewhere between 60 and 100 times per minute, meaning a hibernating ground squirrel's heart rate can drop to a tiny fraction of even that already slow human baseline. This is not a gradual, continuous slowdown either, but rather occurs in cycles throughout the hibernation period, with the animal periodically rousing itself partially, warming slightly and briefly increasing heart rate and metabolic activity before dropping back down into deep hibernation. Again, a pattern researchers still do not fully understand the complete purpose of, though it may relate to periodic tissue repair or waste processing needs that cannot be adequately handled during the deepest, coldest phase of dormancy. Managing a controlled, repeated cycle of near shutdown and partial revival month after month without triggering fatal cardiac complications represents an extraordinarily precise feat of internal physiological regulation occurring silently underground. Through the entire coldest stretch of the year, invisible to anyone above ground, going about their own winter, entirely unaware of what is happening just beneath the frozen surface. Gather together everything covered across this stretch of the story, and a clear pattern comes into sharp focus. Deceptive caching, sophisticated enough to draw serious comparison to primate-level social reasoning. Prairie dog communication detailed enough that some researchers now debate whether it qualifies as a primitive language. Observational learning, confirmed through rigorous, controlled experimentation. And hibernation physiology so extreme involving body temperatures near freezing and heart rates dropping to a mere handful of beats per minute that it has drawn genuine interest from medical researchers well outside the field of wildlife biology entirely. None of this belongs to some rare, exotic creature glimpsed only through a nature documentary filmed on a distant continent. Every single behavior and adaptation just described belongs to an animal found in ordinary backyards, city parks, and open grasslands across the entire country, easily observed by anyone willing to actually stop and pay attention for more than a few passing seconds. That combination, genuine sophistication paired with total everyday familiarity, is precisely what makes the squirrel worth taking seriously as a subject in its own right, rather than dismissing it as background scenery. What remains ahead moves the story outward from intelligence and physiology into scale itself. The sheer size, numbers, and reach of this family, once its full range and reproductive pace come fully into view. Return to that earlier number, 10,000 buried nuts from a single squirrel across one autumn season, and now multiply it outward. A typical suburban neighborhood or modest patch of forest might support anywhere from several dozen to several hundred squirrels, depending on habitat quality and food availability. And each one of those individual animals is independently running its own version of that same caching marathon throughout the fall months. Do the basic arithmetic honestly without exaggeration, and the combined total of buried nuts across even a modest local population can climb into the hundreds of thousands. Sometimes well beyond that, in areas with dense squirrel populations and abundant mature oak or hickory trees. This is not one animal's remarkable effort anymore. It is an entire underground network of independently buried, independently remembered food caches layered on top of each other across the same shared ground, overlapping without any coordination or shared record between the individual animals responsible for it. Picture an ordinary neighborhood park, the kind with a scattering of oak trees and a walking path cutting through the middle, and understand that beneath its unremarkable grass and fallen leaves sits a genuinely staggering density of hidden, deliberately placed food. More than any single person walking through that same park on an autumn afternoon would ever begin to suspect existed beneath their own feet. Narrow the focus down to a more precise unit of measurement, a single acre of oak forest, roughly the size of a football field, and the concentration of buried caches within that specific patch of ground becomes even more striking when, translated into a number, researchers have actually attempted to estimate through field studies. Depending on local squirrel density and the productivity of that year's acorn crop, a single acre of good oak habitat can end up holding tens of thousands of individually buried nuts by the time autumn caching activity winds down for the season. That means within an area you could walk across in well under a minute, an area small enough to picture clearly in your mind without much effort. Tens of thousands of separate, deliberate burial decisions sit scattered beneath the surface, each one made independently by one of several different squirrels sharing that same modest patch of forest. No survey team mapped those locations. No central record exists anywhere describing where any of them are. The only functioning memory of that entire underground network exists scattered across the individual minds of however many squirrels happen to call that acre home, each one carrying its own private fraction of the total picture with considerable overlap and competition layered on top as those same animals continue watching, stealing from, and occasionally deceiving each other throughout the entire season. Here is a comparison worth sitting with directly, since it translates an abstract number into something considerably easier to hold in mind. Picture a substantial backyard vegetable garden, the kind many people this generation have tended personally. At some point, rows of beans, tomatoes, squash, and corn, each seed carefully placed by hand at planting time, one seed, one hole. Considerable deliberate effort involved in getting the whole garden into the ground properly each spring. Now imagine that same gardener repeating that entire planting process, every single seed dozens of times over across a single season, moving and reburying each seed multiple additional times after the initial planting, all guided purely by memory rather than any marked rows or garden map. That repetitive, memory-dependent labor scaled up considerably and repeated constantly throughout an entire autumn gives a reasonably honest sense of what a single squirrel's caching workload genuinely resembles in terms of sheer volume and required precision. Most people who have gardened seriously understand instinctively just how much sustained effort even a single careful planting session actually demands. A squirrel performs a task of comparable intensity and precision, repeated many times over entirely from memory, with no rows, no map, and no notebook, executing it correctly, often enough to survive an entire winter as a direct result. Shift now toward reproduction, another axis where squirrel biology delivers genuinely surprising scale once examined closely. A healthy female squirrel typically produces two separate litters within a single calendar year, one in late winter or early spring, and a second in mid to late summer, with each litter generally containing somewhere between 2 and 4 pups, though litters of 5 or more do occur under particularly favorable conditions. Across both litters combined, a single productive female can therefore bring somewhere between 4 and 8 new squirrels into the world. Within just 12 months, a reproductive pace considerably faster than most people would assume for an animal roughly the size of a small house cat's tail. This reproductive rate matters enormously for population dynamics, since it allows squirrel populations to rebound quickly after a harsh winter or a period of reduced numbers. And it also helps explain how squirrel populations can expand rapidly into newly favorable habitat. Whether a maturing suburban neighborhood with newly established trees or a city park recently landscaped with the kind of mature oak squirrels favor for both food and nesting. 2 litters a year, repeated across a female's several-year reproductive lifespan, adds up to a considerable personal contribution to the local population over time. One female potentially responsible for dozens of offspring across her own natural lifespan. At the very start of that reproductive cycle sits a newborn squirrel in a state of almost total helplessness, a detail easy to overlook given how capable and agile adult squirrels appear during any ordinary daytime observation. A newborn squirrel emerges blind, its eyes still sealed shut and almost entirely hairless, its skin pink and exposed. With a body small enough that several newborns together could comfortably fit within the space of a single adult human hand, each individual pup smaller than an average human thumb. This near-total vulnerability at birth stands in sharp contrast to the confident, quick-moving animal most people picture when thinking of squirrels generally. And it means the mother alone bears complete responsibility for warmth, protection, and nutrition during those earliest, most fragile weeks of life. She typically raises her litter within a carefully constructed nest, either a leaf-built structure high in a tree's branches or a more protected cavity within a hollow trunk, defending that nest fiercely against potential threats, while the pups remain completely dependent on her for survival. The gap between this fragile starting point and the agile, resourceful adult that eventually emerges from it is considerable, and the speed at which that transformation actually happens turns out to be genuinely remarkable in its own right, a detail worth exploring directly. The transformation from that blind, hairless newborn into a fully independent, self-sufficient animal happens on a timeline considerably faster than most people would expect. Within roughly 10 weeks of birth, a young squirrel has typically opened its eyes, grown a full coat of fur, developed functional climbing and jumping ability, and begun venturing outside the nest to forage and cache food entirely on its own without direct maternal guidance required for each individual attempt. This represents an enormously compressed developmental timeline transitioning from total helplessness to functional independence in a span of time considerably shorter than a single human school semester. By comparison, many other mammals of roughly similar adult size take considerably longer to reach comparable levels of independent competence. This rapid developmental pace likely reflects the same underlying evolutionary pressures, shaping so much of squirrel biology already covered. Throughout this account, a relatively short natural lifespan combined with real seasonal urgency, since a pup born in spring needs to reach reasonable self-sufficiency well before the following winter arrives with its own serious survival demands. 10 weeks then marks the rough boundary between complete dependency and a young squirrel taking its first independent steps into exactly the same complex world of caching, memory deception, and competition already explored at length throughout the earlier portions of this story. Widen the lens now beyond any single species and consider the true scope of the broader squirrel family as a whole. Sciuridae, the formal scientific family encompassing squirrels and their closest relatives, includes more than 200 distinct recognized species, a genuinely large and diverse family by mammalian standards, spread across nearly every continent on Earth, with the sole exception of Antarctica. This family includes the familiar tree squirrels most people picture immediately, but also flying squirrels, gliding silently through nighttime forests, ground squirrels burrowing across open prairies and deserts, chipmunks scurrying along forest floors and hiking trails, prairie dogs maintaining vast underground colonies across the American plains, and marmots occupying high mountain meadows across multiple continents. That range of body types, habitats, and specific behavioral adaptations all descended from a shared ancestral lineage. and unified under one formal taxonomic family, represents a genuinely successful evolutionary template. Flexible enough to be reshaped repeatedly into dramatically different forms, suited to dramatically different environments, while still retaining enough core shared traits that continuously growing in size or structure, chief among them to remain clearly recognizable as members of the same underlying family no matter how different they might first appear sitting side by side. At the smallest extreme of that family's considerable size range sits the African pygmy squirrel, among the tiniest squirrel species recognized anywhere in the world, with a fully grown adult body small enough to rest comfortably within. An ordinary coffee mug tail included in some individuals. Native to dense tropical forests across parts of West and Central Africa, this diminutive species spends much of its time foraging along tree bark for insects and fungi rather than the nuts and seeds more commonly associated with its larger North American cousins. Its small size offers genuine practical advantages within its specific habitat, allowing it to move along thin branches and narrow bark crevices completely inaccessible to larger squirrel species. Exploiting a food niche essentially reserved exclusively for an animal small enough to access it in the first place. Standing this species next to the familiar backyard gray squirrel, discussed throughout most of this account, highlights just how much size variation the broader squirrel family actually contains, considerably more than most people would assume from casual, everyday familiarity with just one or two locally common species. The same fundamental biological template that shared ancestral body plan discussed earlier stretches remarkably far in both directions, scaling down to something small enough to nearly disappear inside a closed hand. At the opposite extreme sits the alpine marmot, a substantial ground-dwelling member of the same broader squirrel family, native to high mountain meadows across parts of Europe, where it can grow to weigh as much as a large, well-fed house cat, a genuinely enormous size difference when set directly beside the coffee mug-sized pygmy squirrel discussed just previously. Alpine marmots live in complex social burrow systems, dug into mountain slopes, and like several other ground-dwelling relatives already discussed, they undergo true seasonal hibernation, sometimes lasting more than half the year, given the harsh extended winters common at the high altitudes these animals typically inhabit. Their considerable size, especially compared against smaller tree-dwelling squirrel species, reflects specific adaptations suited to their particular environment and lifestyle. Greater fat storage capacity, supporting genuinely extended hibernation periods along with a more robust, ground-adapted body better suited to extensive digging and burrow construction than to the agile branch-to-branch leaping that shapes a tree squirrel's much lighter frame. Considered together, the pygmy squirrel and the alpine marmot represent something close to the outer boundaries of size variation found anywhere within this single, remarkably adaptable family. A family capable of producing both an animal small enough to vanish inside a coffee mug and one substantial enough to rival a healthy, well-fed household cat in overall body weight. Shift now toward a genuinely dramatic historical phenomenon, documented repeatedly throughout the 1800s across parts of North America. Mass squirrel migrations involving numbers substantial enough to draw serious contemporary newspaper coverage and considerable public attention at the time. On several documented occasions during that century, gray squirrel populations experienced such explosive growth following an unusually productive mast year, a season when oak and other nut-bearing trees produced exceptionally abundant seed crops that the following year's population, swollen well beyond what the local habitat could actually sustain, began moving en masse across the landscape in search of adequate food elsewhere. These migrations reportedly involved squirrel numbers reaching well into the millions, across some of the larger documented events, moving in a broadly consistent direction, across considerable distances, crossing open farmland roads, and even substantial rivers along the way, with a meaningful number of individual animals drowning during particularly difficult water crossings. This represents a genuinely startling historical phenomenon, an ordinary backyard animal suddenly appearing in numbers and coordinated movement patterns considerably more associated in popular imagination with African wildebeest or similarly dramatic large-scale animal migrations. The scale of these documented 19th century events offers a striking historical counterpoint to the quiet, individually scattered behavior of the modern backyard squirrel most people picture today. Contemporary newspaper accounts from the 1850s, particularly around the year 1857, describe scenes that read almost like exaggerated tall tales today, except they were reported straightforwardly as ordinary regional news at the time without the sensationalized framing A modern reader might expect surrounding an event this unusual. Farmers across parts of the Midwest and eastern United States reported vast numbers of gray squirrels moving steadily through their fields over the course of days, often in a broadly consistent direction, showing little of the typical caution or wariness these animals normally display around human activity and open exposed ground. Some accounts describe squirrels swimming across rivers and streams that would ordinarily represent a significant natural barrier, with a meaningful portion of the migrating animals reportedly drowning during these crossings, exhausted or overwhelmed by currents partway through the attempt. Local hunters and farmers, faced with sudden vast numbers of squirrels moving through cultivated farmland capable of causing real agricultural damage along the way, sometimes organized informal efforts specifically in response to these migration events, treating a sudden abundance as both a genuine nuisance to protect crops against, and in some reported cases, a welcome and unusually convenient source of food. These historical accounts, preserved in period newspapers rather than modern retrospective summary, offer a rare documented window into just how dramatically squirrel population dynamics can shift under the right combination of environmental pressures. The underlying cause behind these dramatic 19th century migrations connects directly back to the same boom and bust food cycle already discussed regarding acorn and hickory nut production. A particularly abundant mast year, meaning an unusually productive season for oak, hickory, and similar nut-bearing trees, allows squirrel populations to expand rapidly, since more available food directly supports higher survival rates and increased reproductive success across that thriving population. Problems arise the following year. If that same region then experiences a poor mast year, a season of unusually low nut production, whether due to unfavorable weather during pollination, disease affecting the trees, or simply the natural cyclical pattern, many nut-bearing trees follow across multiple growing seasons. A squirrel population that has already expanded considerably based on the previous year's abundance suddenly finds itself facing dramatically reduced food availability well below what the local habitat can sustain for a population that size. Faced with genuine starvation pressure, squirrels respond by moving sometimes in large, loosely coordinated numbers toward areas that might offer better food availability elsewhere. A migration driven purely by basic survival necessity, rather than any organized or deliberate, collective decision. This boom and bust cycle abundance, followed by scarcity, followed by dramatic population movement, represents a genuinely powerful natural force capable of producing migration events dramatic enough to make front-page regional news well over a century and a half ago. The speed at which squirrel populations can expand following a genuinely abundant food season deserves direct attention on its own, since the pace involved often surprises people unfamiliar with just how quickly this particular reproductive and survival dynamic can play out. Following a season of exceptionally strong acorn or hickory nut production, wildlife biologists tracking local squirrel populations have documented population increases substantial enough to effectively double the local number of squirrels within a single following year, driven by a combination of improved survival rates through the following winter and increased reproductive success the following spring and summer. This kind of rapid doubling reflects the squirrel's considerable underlying reproductive capacity. 2 litters annually, several pups per litter discussed earlier, suddenly translating into dramatically improved real-world outcomes. Once the usual limiting factor, available food, temporarily stops constraining population growth. It also helps explain why squirrel numbers in any given area can feel noticeably different from one year to the next, considerably more squirrels visible in a particular park or neighborhood following a strong acorn year, compared to a leaner season the year before. This volatility, populations capable of both rapid expansion following abundance and significant decline following scarcity, represents a genuinely dynamic biological system constantly responding to environmental conditions rather than settling into any fixed stable number year after year. Population booms, dramatic enough to threaten agricultural crops, prompted a genuinely organized human response across several states during periods of documented squirrel overabundance, particularly through the 1800s when agricultural communities depended heavily on grain and corn. Harvests vulnerable to significant squirrel damage when local populations swelled beyond typical numbers. Some states and local jurisdictions established formal bounty systems during these periods, offering payment to hunters and farmers for each squirrel, killed, a direct financial incentive aimed at reducing local populations quickly enough to protect vulnerable crops from serious damage during a particularly bad boom year. Historical records indicate these organized bounty efforts sometimes resulted in genuinely enormous numbers of squirrels killed across a single hunting season within a particular state or region, reflecting both the severity of the population boom being addressed and the effectiveness of financial incentive in mobilizing widespread participation from the local hunting community. This history offers a striking counterpoint to how most modern Americans relate to squirrels today, a mild backyard nuisance at worst for most homeowners, rather than a serious agricultural threat requiring organized, government-sanctioned population control measures. It is a reminder that the relationship between this particular animal and American communities has shifted considerably over time, shaped directly by changing agricultural practices, changing land use patterns, and the gradual urbanization that has fundamentally altered where and how most squirrel populations exist today. Turn now toward a different caching strategy altogether, employed by the American red squirrel, a smaller, more aggressively territorial cousin of the familiar gray squirrel, common across northern forests and mountainous regions where conifer seeds form the bulk of its diet. Rather than scattering thousands of individual caches across a wide territory the way gray squirrels typically do, red squirrels instead concentrate the bulk of their winter food supply into one or a small handful of centralized storage piles called middens, sometimes accumulating a volume of stockpiled pine cones and seeds substantial enough to fill a space comparable to a small garden shed. This centralized approach carries obvious risk, since losing that single concentrated stockpile to theft or destruction would represent a genuinely catastrophic loss compared to the more distributed risk spread across a gray squirrel's thousands of scattered individual caches. Red squirrels compensate for that concentrated vulnerability through fierce, near-constant territorial defense, aggressively chasing off virtually any other squirrel, red or otherwise, that approaches too closely to their carefully guarded midden. This represents a genuinely different survival strategy, operating under the very same broader family umbrella. Distributed risk through scattered caching versus concentrated defense of one substantial centralized stockpile, each approach carrying its own trade-offs between vulnerability and efficiency, and both proving successful enough to persist across countless generations within their respective species. Consider the sheer accumulated effort compressed into one of these red squirrel middens, since the comparison helps translate an abstract volume into something considerably easier to appreciate properly. Building a stockpile substantial enough to fill a space the size of a small shed requires months of near-continuous gathering, one cone, one seed cluster at a time, carried individually back to the same central location and added methodically to the growing pile across an entire autumn season of dedicated repetitive labor. Unlike a gray squirrel's approach, which spreads that same total workload across thousands of separate locations scattered throughout its territory, a red squirrel instead channels that entire seasonal effort into building and then defending one single concentrated asset, functioning essentially as a personal winter pantry, rather than a distributed network of scattered backup tender locations. Losing that single midden to theft, fire, or destruction during the wrong moment would eliminate an entire season's accumulated effort in one stroke, which explains the genuinely intense, near-obsessive territorial defense red squirrels display around their own middens, chattering aggressively and physically chasing off intruders, with a level of sustained vigilance considerably more pronounced than what gray squirrels typically display, defending any single one of their own, numerous individually less valuable scattered caches. The total ground a single squirrel actively works across during a typical season extends considerably farther than most casual observers would assume, watching one animal dart briefly across a single backyard. A gray squirrel's full home range the entire territory. It regularly travels, forages, and caches food within across an active season. Commonly spans somewhere between 1 and several acres depending on local food density and population pressure from neighboring squirrels competing for the same general area. Translated into a more familiar visual reference, that range can easily stretch across an area comparable to several football fields laid end to end. A considerably larger working territory than the single tree or backyard fence line most people mentally associate with any one individual squirrel they happen to notice regularly in their own yard. Within that full range, a squirrel maintains ongoing awareness of food sources, competitor locations, nesting sites, and predator activity, continuously updating its own internal map of the entire area as conditions shift throughout the season. That single squirrel confidently darting along a familiar fence line or scampering up a particular backyard tree is very likely operating well beyond the boundaries of any one yard, treating an entire stretch of connected neighborhood, several combined properties worth of trees, gardens, and open ground as one single, continuously monitored working territory. Among tree squirrel species, the fox squirrel, generally somewhat larger than its more common gray squirrel cousin, demonstrates leaping ability genuinely impressive enough to warrant direct comparison against its own body size. A fox squirrel measuring somewhere around 10 to 12 inches in body length has been documented executing leaps, covering horizontal distances well beyond 10 times that same body length in a single bound, launching from one branch and landing securely on another, positioned considerably farther away than casual observation would suggest possible for an animal of that modest overall size. Scaled up proportionally to human dimensions, a comparable leap for an average adult person would translate into clearing a distance well beyond 60 feet in a single standing jump, a feat no unaided human has ever come remotely close to achieving under any circumstances. This leaping capability draws directly on several previously discussed anatomical features working together in coordinated fashion, powerful hind limb muscles generating the initial launching force, that finely tuned tail acting as a real-time stabilizing counterbalance throughout the entire leap, and precise depth perception and spatial judgment guiding an accurate, confident landing on a target branch that might be swaying slightly in open air. It represents genuinely elite athletic performance packed into an animal most people never think to credit with anything more than casual backyard agility. Draw together the reproductive and developmental threads covered across this stretch of the story, and the overall pace involved becomes genuinely striking when considered as one complete picture. A blind, hairless newborn, smaller than a human thumb, transforms within roughly 10 weeks into a fully independent animal capable of navigating complex three-dimensional forest terrain, executing leaps spanning 10 times its own body length, and beginning the lifelong work of caching, memory building, and social navigation already explored in considerable depth throughout this account. That entire transformation, total dependency to genuine self-sufficiency, compresses into a span of time shorter than a typical human academic semester, a pace considerably faster than most comparably sized mammals require to reach similar developmental milestones. Multiply that individual timeline across 2 litters annually, several pups per litter, and a female squirrel's own multi-year reproductive lifespan, and the underlying reproductive engine, driving everything discussed regarding population booms, historical mass migrations, and rapid recovery from lean years, comes into much clearer focus. Growth, this fast, reproduction, this efficient, and population dynamics, this responsive to shifting environmental conditions together, explain how one small, unassuming mammal has managed to remain so consistently, reliably present across such an enormous range of environments and centuries of shifting human land use. Pause here at the close of this stretch and hold the full scale together at once. Hundreds of thousands of buried nuts scattered across a single modest neighborhood, tens of thousands within just 1 acre of decent oak forest. A reproductive engine capable of doubling a local population within a single favorable season, and historically capable of producing migrations numbering in the millions of individual animals. A family stretching from something small enough to rest inside a coffee mug to something substantial enough to rival a well-fed house cat. None of this scale announces itself visibly to anyone glancing casually out a window at an ordinary backyard on an ordinary afternoon. The lawn looks like a lawn. The park looks like a park. Underneath that unremarkable surface, though, sits a density of buried decisions, remembered locations, and accumulated reproductive momentum considerably harder to picture honestly than most people ever attempt to. This story now turns toward one final direction, away from raw scale and back toward meaning. Considering what this animal actually represents within the broader ecosystem, it inhabits its complicated relationship with the humans who share that same space, and the genuine scientific mysteries still left entirely unresolved even after everything already covered across this account. Return now to that earlier detail about imperfect memory, and give it the fuller weight it genuinely deserves within the broader story of American forests. Every autumn, squirrels across the country bury a portion of their cached nuts that simply never gets reclaimed, whether through death, genuine forgetting, or environmental disruption to the original burial site. Left undisturbed through winter in loose, well-aerated soil at an appropriate planting depth, A meaningful share of those forgotten acorns and hickory nuts sprout successfully come spring, becoming genuine new seedlings rather than simply decomposing uneaten in place. Forest ecologists studying oak and hickory regeneration have identified squirrel caching as a significant, well-documented contributor to how these particular tree species actually spread and establish new growth across a landscape, in some respects rivaling or even exceeding the role wind dispersal plays for other tree species with lighter, more easily scattered seeds. Oak and hickory nuts are comparatively heavy and do not travel far on their own once they fall straight down from the parent tree, meaning without some active transport mechanism carrying them meaningful distances away, new growth would remain clustered tightly and inefficiently around existing mature trees rather than spreading outward across open or recovering ground. The squirrel quite unintentionally solves that exact transport problem, carrying nuts considerable distances before burying them, then failing to reclaim enough of them to meaningfully reseed the surrounding forest. Push that previous point toward its full, almost startling implication. Considerable stretches of oak and hickory forests standing across the American landscape today trace their actual origin back to individual squirrels that buried a nut decades or even generations earlier, and then for whatever reason simply never returned to retrieve it. This is not a minor ecological footnote confined to a handful of unusual cases. Forest ecologists studying regeneration patterns have found squirrel caching to be a genuinely major contributing factor behind how oak and hickory forests actually spread and re-establish themselves across cleared, burned, or otherwise disturbed land, sometimes rivaling other, more commonly credited dispersal mechanisms in overall ecological impact. Every mature oak visible along a familiar hiking trail, every hickory tree shading a backyard built decades after the surrounding land was first cleared, for a suburban development carries some genuine, non-trivial statistical likelihood of having started as exactly this, an accidental gift, planted by an animal that was simply trying to save that one particular nut for its own future use, and through sheer imperfect memory ended up quietly reshaping the surrounding landscape instead. There is something worth sitting with in that an entire forest's worth of consequence emerging not from any deliberate act of planting but from countless small, unremarkable failures of memory, repeated patiently across an almost unimaginable span of time. The squirrel's ecological footprint extends well beyond its unintentional role in forest regeneration alone. Tree cavities and ground burrows originally excavated or claimed by squirrels for their own nesting purposes frequently continue serving a genuinely useful function even after the original squirrel occupants move elsewhere or die, providing ready-made shelter for an entirely different range of species, entirely incapable of excavating comparable structures on their own. Various snake species, numerous insect populations, and a range of small mammals have all been documented making regular use of abandoned squirrel burrows and tree cavities, benefiting directly from structural work. The original squirrel occupant performed purely for its own survival needs, with no benefit whatsoever intended for the species that eventually inherit that same space. This kind of secondary habitat uses one species unintentionally supporting an entirely different range of species through structures built purely for its own purposes, represents a well-recognized ecological pattern found across many different environments, and squirrels contribute a meaningful, well-documented share of it within the specific forest and woodland ecosystems they inhabit. It is a quiet, largely invisible form of ecological generosity, extended without any intention behind it whatsoever, simply an accidental byproduct of one animal's ordinary self-interested search for adequate shelter, echoing quite closely the same accidental generosity already discussed regarding forgotten caches, eventually growing into entirely new trees. Taken together, forgotten caches becoming new trees and abandoned burrows becoming shelter for entirely different species. A clear and genuinely important pattern emerges regarding the squirrel's true ecological role. This is an animal whose daily, entirely self-interested behavior, burying food purely to feed itself later, digging shelter purely to protect itself and its own offspring, ends up producing consequences that ripple considerably beyond its own individual survival needs, meaningfully shaping forest composition and providing usable shelter infrastructure for a range of entirely unrelated species sharing the same, broader ecosystem. Ecologists sometimes describe species playing this kind of outsized structural role within their environment as ecosystem engineers. Animals whose ordinary activity meaningfully reshapes the physical or biological environment in ways that other species then come to depend on whether those other species realize it or not. The squirrel earns that designation honestly through consistent, well-documented ecological impact rather than through any romanticized exaggeration of its importance. None of this requires imagining the squirrel as somehow deliberately generous or thoughtfully considerate toward its ecosystem. It requires only recognizing that ordinary survival behavior repeated consistently across countless individual animals and an enormous span of accumulated time naturally produces consequences considerably larger than any single animal's own immediate, self-interested motivations, a pattern worth appreciating honestly, rather than either overstating or dismissing entirely. Turn now toward the squirrel's considerably more complicated, more immediately personal relationship with the humans who actually share their neighborhoods and backyards on a daily basis. For a great many American homeowners, particularly those who enjoy gardening or maintaining bird feeders, squirrels represent a genuinely persistent, a recurring seasonal challenge, rather than simply a pleasant wildlife sighting to enjoy from a distance. Bulbs planted carefully each fall sometimes disappear entirely by spring, dug up and either eaten or relocated by squirrels, treating a carefully planned flower bed as simply another convenient caching location. Vegetable gardens face similar pressure with tomatoes, squash, and other produce occasionally sampled, damaged, or stolen outright just as they approach ripeness. Bird feeders, as already discussed earlier in this account, face near constant rating pressure from squirrels, perfectly willing and able to overcome most casual deterrents, standing between themselves and a concentrated, easily accessible food source. This ongoing tension, one shared by generations of American homeowners tending their own small patch of land, has produced an entire minor industry built around squirrel deterrents, baffles, spicy seed blends, motion-activated sprinklers, and countless other products marketed specifically toward winning what often turns out to be a fairly one-sided contest. It is a familiar, mostly good-natured domestic rivalry, repeated in backyards across the entire country, season after season, without any real resolution in sight. The squirrel-proof bird feeder industry, despite decades of increasingly elaborate engineering, weighted perches, spring-loaded closures, motion-activated mechanisms, angled baffles, has produced remarkably few products capable of holding out against a genuinely determined squirrel for any meaningful length of time. Product reviews and casual homeowner testimonials alike are filled with the same recurring story. A feeder purchased specifically for its squirrel-resistant marketing claims installed with real optimism and then defeated entirely, within a matter of days, by a local squirrel population apparently unimpressed by whatever mechanical obstacle the manufacturer considered sufficient. This pattern connects directly back to the documented problem-solving, persistence, and observational learning already discussed earlier in considerable scientific detail. A squirrel facing a genuinely difficult feeder mechanism will typically try multiple different approaches in sequence, adjusting its technique based on what does and does not work. And once one squirrel in a local population successfully cracks a particular design, that solution tends to spread relatively quickly to neighboring squirrels through the same observational learning documented in formal laboratory research. The homeowner, meanwhile, often experiences this as pure frustration, another failed product. Another lesson learned the hard way about underestimating a small animal, easy to dismiss as simple. In truth, that same homeowner has simply run headfirst into one of the more genuinely sophisticated problem solvers found anywhere in their own backyard, armed with better research and development than most people ever bother crediting it with. Despite all the intelligence, agility, and sophisticated caching strategy already covered at length throughout this account, the squirrel remains firmly positioned within the middle of a considerably larger food web, hunted regularly and consistently by a genuinely wide range of predators across nearly every environment it inhabits. Hawks and owls represent significant aerial threats, capable of striking quickly from above with little warning, which helps explain the squirrel's already discussed near-panoramic peripheral vision and constant near-reflexive vigilance toward anything moving overhead. On the ground, foxes and a range of similarly sized predatory mammals hunt squirrels opportunistically whenever the chance arises. While various snake species pose a particular threat to nests and burrows, especially vulnerable during the earliest, most helpless weeks of a young squirrel's development already described earlier in this account. This constant multi-directional predation pressure from above, from the ground, and even within the presumed safety of a nest or burrow represents a genuinely serious, ongoing survival challenge, and it directly explains a considerable share of the specific adaptations already covered throughout this story. That wide field of vision, that rapid, agile leaping ability, that instinctive wariness towards sudden movement or unfamiliar sound. Every impressive capability already discussed exists, at least in part, because failing to develop it would have meant becoming a considerably easier meal for one of these several persistent capable predators. That near constant alertness so many people casually notice in squirrels, the frequent pausing mid-motion, the sudden freeze, the quick darting glance in several directions before continuing whatever activity was briefly interrupted, is not simply nervous high-strung temperament for its own sake. It reflects a genuine, near-daily calculation running continuously in the background of the animal's entire waking life, constantly weighing the real present risk posed by multiple different predator types, capable of attacking from entirely different risk directions and using entirely different hunting strategies. A squirrel that grew genuinely complacent, that stopped checking overhead regularly for hawks, or stopped watching the ground carefully for an approaching fox, would very likely not survive long enough to reproduce successfully, meaning natural selection has consistently favored individuals maintaining exactly this kind of persistent, low-level vigilance across an entire lifetime. What looks from a comfortable distance like simple twitchy nervousness is examined honestly and up close, a finely calibrated survival strategy, constantly balancing the very real energetic cost of near-constant alertness against the equally real considerably higher cost of 2,000 avro, failing to notice an approaching threat even once. Understanding this reframes something most people observe constantly without ever really considering closely. That quick characteristic pause and glance performed by nearly every squirrel encountered in nearly every ordinary backyard, revealing it as a small, continuous act of genuine survival calculation rather than mere idle jumpiness. For all the detailed behavioral research already covered throughout this account regarding squirrel memory, cache recovery, and spatial navigation, one genuinely significant question remains only partially answered. Even today, the precise, underlying neurological mechanism actually responsible for storing and organizing that considerable spatial information within the squirrel brain itself. Researchers have identified brain regions in various mammals, including some rodent species, associated broadly with spatial memory and navigation, and reasonable working hypotheses exist, suggesting squirrels likely rely on comparable neural structures. However, the specific details exactly how thousands of individual cache locations get encoded, organized, prioritized, and eventually retrieved from within a brain, considerably smaller and structurally different from the more extensively studied laboratory rodent brains. Most neuroscience research has traditionally focused on remain considerably less well understood than the behavioral outcomes themselves. Scientists can measure with reasonable confidence and detail how well a squirrel performs at actually recovering its own caches under various field and laboratory conditions. Explaining precisely how that impressive performance gets accomplished at the neural level, cell by cell and connection by connection, remains an active, genuinely unresolved area of ongoing research rather than a fully settled scientific question. The behavior itself has been documented thoroughly. The exact biological machinery producing that behavior still holds real acknowledged mystery. A closely related and similarly unresolved scientific question concerns whether squirrels experience anything genuinely comparable to human episodic memory, the specific capacity to consciously recall a particular personal event complete, with rich contextual detail about when and where it happened, rather than simply retaining general learned information or habitual associations without any accompanying sense of personal recollection attached. When a squirrel successfully navigates back to a specific cache buried months earlier, researchers cannot currently determine with full scientific confidence whether that success reflects something functionally similar to a person consciously remembering a specific past event, complete with some internal sense of having personally experienced burying that particular nut at that particular time and place, or whether it instead reflects a more automatic, less consciously experienced form of spatial and associative memory, operating without any accompanying subjective sense of personal recollection at all. This distinction matters enormously to researchers studying animal cognition broadly, since episodic memory has traditionally been considered a particularly sophisticated cognitive capacity. one closely tied to broader questions about animal consciousness and subjective experience that remain genuinely difficult to test or confirm directly in any species, incapable of verbally describing its own internal mental experience. The honest, appropriately cautious scientific answer today remains genuinely uncertain, acknowledging real, demonstrated behavioral sophistication while stopping well short of confidently claiming to know exactly what, if anything, that sophisticated behavior actually feels like from the squirrel's own internal perspective. Among the more actively developing areas of current squirrel research involves the question of whether shifting seasonal timing changes in when trees flower, when nuts mature, and when the first hard frosts of autumn typically arrive might be gradually altering the timing of squirrel caching behavior itself. Researchers tracking long-term data on tree nut production alongside corresponding squirrel behavioral patterns have begun investigating whether any meaningful mismatch is developing between when food actually becomes available in a given region and when squirrels instinctively expect that food to appear based on patterns established over countless previous generations. This kind of timing mismatch, if it exists in any measurable significant way, could carry real consequences for squirrel populations, potentially affecting how successfully they manage to build adequate winter reserves before colder weather genuinely arrives in force. This research remains genuinely ongoing rather than settled, with results so far suggesting the picture is considerably more complicated and regionally variable than any simple uniform pattern would suggest. Some populations appear to be adjusting their behavior gradually alongside shifting conditions, while others show less clear evidence of meaningful adaptation so far. It stands as a genuinely current, actively pursued scientific question, one without a fully confirmed answer, yet being investigated by researchers, precisely because getting the answer right actually matters, for understanding how this remarkably adaptable animal might fare across the coming decades. Anyone who has spent time in certain specific American and Canadian cities has likely noticed something that stands out immediately against the far more common gray or reddish-brown coloring found in most squirrel populations. Elsewhere entirely, black squirrels moving through the same trees and parks as their more typically colored relatives. These black squirrels are not a separate species, entirely distinct from the familiar gray squirrel. They represent a genetic color variant, technically known as melanism, arising from a specific mutation affecting pigmentation that has become unusually common and concentrated within certain isolated local populations, sometimes making up a genuinely significant share. Occasionally, even a clear majority of the squirrels found within one particular city or region, while remaining considerably rarer or entirely absent, just a relatively short distance away. Researchers studying the geographic distribution of this particular color variant continue actively working to map exactly where these concentrated black squirrel populations exist across North America, and to better understand the specific historical and genetic factors that allowed this variant to become locally dominant in certain specific places, rather than spreading more evenly and gradually across the species' entire overall range. It remains a genuinely active area of ongoing genetic and population research, blending straightforward genetics with the messier, harder to fully untangle historical questions of exactly how small, isolated founding populations sometimes end up shaping an entire region's dominant coloring for considered generations afterward. Beyond simply mapping where black squirrel populations exist, a deeper and still genuinely unresolved question concerns exactly why that particular dark coloring has persisted and even expanded within certain specific city populations, rather than gradually fading back toward the more common gray coloring found across the broader regional population surrounding it. Several competing hypotheses exist among researchers studying this question directly. Some propose that darker fur might offer a genuine thermal advantage in certain specific climate conditions, absorbing and retaining slightly more heat during colder months. Though the supporting evidence for this particular explanation remains genuinely mixed and inconclusive, rather than clearly confirmed across the various affected populations studied so far. Others suggest founder effects may explain much of the pattern, small, genetically distinct founding populations happening to include a disproportionate share of the melanistic gene variant, which then simply persisted and spread naturally as that particular local population expanded over subsequent generations, independent of any specific survival advantage the coloring itself might or might not actually confer. Still others wonder whether black coloring might offer certain squirrels some subtle camouflage or predator avoidance advantage within specific urban settings. Though this particular explanation likewise remains more speculative than firmly established through direct supporting evidence. No single explanation has yet been confirmed as clearly correct, leaving this specific visually striking variation as one more genuinely open question within the broader, still actively developing science of squirrel biology. Bring the story's central thread on memory back into full focus one final time, because it deserves to be stated plainly and directly before this account moves toward its close. A squirrel's brain weighs only a few grams and occupies a volume roughly comparable to an actual walnut, a genuinely small, unremarkable-looking organ, by almost any standard measure applied to brains generally across the broader animal kingdom. And yet, packed within that modest physical space, this animal manages reliably and repeatedly across every single season of its adult life to encode, organize, and successfully retrieve information regarding thousands of individually significant locations scattered across a considerable home range, adjusting its own caching strategy in real time based on social pressure from watching rivals, and doing all of this while simultaneously managing near-constant predator vigilance, seasonal reproduction, and the ordinary daily demands of finding enough food to survive. There is something genuinely worth pausing over in that combination: walnut-sized simplicity on the outside, remarkably intricate functional complexity operating quietly underneath. It is easy to assume carelessly, and without much real thought, that a small brain necessarily means a simple, limited mind incapable of anything particularly sophisticated. The squirrel, examined honestly, and in the kind of careful detail this account has attempted throughout, stands as a fairly direct, well-documented rebuttal to that lazy assumption. The scientific stakes attached to fully understanding squirrel spatial memory extend considerably beyond simple curiosity about one particular species living in ordinary American backyards. Memory researchers working across a range of different fields, from basic neuroscience to comparative cognition to even certain corners of artificial intelligence, research focused on spatial navigation and information storage, have taken genuine interest in squirrel cognition, specifically because it represents such an efficient, compact, and remarkably effective real-world example of complex spatial memory operating successfully within an unusually small physical brain. If researchers eventually manage to fully map and understand exactly how a squirrel's brain accomplishes what it demonstrably accomplishes every single season, encoding, prioritizing, and reliably retrieving thousands of distinct spatial memories, using a comparatively tiny amount of neural tissue, that understanding could plausibly inform broader scientific thinking about memory storage and retrieval more generally, potentially even offering useful conceptual insight relevant to human memory research, or to engineers designing more efficient artificial systems for storing and retrieving spatial information. This is not a settled, foregone conclusion by any means, but it represents a genuinely serious, actively pursued scientific possibility. One more reason this particular animal continues drawing real, dedicated research attention well beyond what its modest, everyday backyard reputation would ever suggest to a casual observer glancing out a window on an ordinary afternoon. And so this account arrives back, finally at the same quiet contradiction. It opened with an animal so common it nearly disappears into the background of ordinary American life, and so genuinely strange, once actually examined closely, that it challenges some fairly basic assumptions about what a small brain and a familiar backyard creature are actually capable of accomplishing, a body engineered with startling precision for falling, climbing, and balancing, a memory system organizing thousands of individually significant locations without any written record whatsoever, a capacity for deception sophisticated enough to draw serious scientific comparison to reasoning once considered uniquely human, an ecological footprint quietly responsible for entire stretches of forest that exist today for no better reason than one small animal's imperfect memory generations ago of exactly where it buried a single nut. Perhaps the genuine mystery here was never really the squirrel itself, sitting quietly on a fence post, tail flicking, watching you exactly as closely and carefully as you might, on occasion, choose to watch it back. Perhaps the deeper mystery was always memory itself, what it is, how it lives inside something as small and unassuming as a walnut-sized brain, and what it might still reveal about minds considerably larger once science finally understands it fully enough to explain it properly. Thank you for spending this time here with me. Until next time.